Secret of Sunset. Once night fell, Kellic visited Richard at his residence. Being notified of this in advance, a barbarian warrior brought him to the backyard where he met Richard in a visitor's area. Richard had returned to Bluewater a new man, his army now a decisive force. With Sinclair having visited the oasis before, even if the buildings on his lands at the fringe of the city were fine, the servants had either died or escaped. For now, he had booked the entire inn he had stayed in before. The original customers could only begrudgingly accept being moved elsewhere. This was a strong and thought-provoking hint. The Golden War Flag was not afraid of anyone and did not care for gold. With him robbing the second-class caravan, everyone in Bluewater now knew of Richard's grudge with Red Cossack. Some even thought back to his battle the first time he had arrived here. Even though this mage was still very young, his ferocity did not lose out to veterans who had been here for many years. Nobody dared to come out and blame him, only able to fling shade at him from behind his back. As per Kellic's request, Flozen was present alongside Richard. The only one outside of the three was Phaser, who was stood by the side of the hall covered from head to toe with a cape and helmet. Kellic's eyes had glimmered with fear upon first seeing her, a shocked expression on his face as he couldn't contain himself for a moment. Phaser did not reveal any part of her skin, with even the lower part of her face covered in shadows. She felt 2 spots on her body burn as Kellic's gaze landed upon her, as if scorching iron had been placed on her person. Shaking uncontrollably, she took a step back as her bladed left hand trembled slightly, letting out a threatening low buzz. Richard felt a sense of danger stirring in his heart at this sight, but he did not let it show on his face. "What's wrong, Mr. Kellic?" he asked. "Are you interested in my guard?" Kellic looked deeply at Phaser once more before retracting his gaze, shaking his head in response. "I would never have thought I would see a warrior of the Sunset Shrine here. And she's even your guard. I haven't even heard of a Sunset Warrior being a guard, but..." "Sunset Warrior? I've never heard of this before, could you please explain?" Richard asked with an inquisitive expression. He could faintly sense a strong aura from Kellic's body. This fellow was supposed to be a mere level 11 to 12 mage, which would not give him any pressure. However, it was as though a shroud of mist enveloped his entire being, leaving Richard unable to see through him. As such, Richard would not take him lightly. Kellic did not answer immediately, squinting at Richard as though he was trying to determine whether he was speaking the truth. "How did you find this guard?" "Coincidence. She needed a job, so I asked her to come and work for me." He naturally wouldn't reveal that Phaser was a special unit made by the Brood Mother. There was an implication in his words that he was unwilling to reveal much about Phaser's background, and if Kellic was smart enough to read between the lines he would drop the matter. Kellic nodded, the doubt in his face slowly fading. He raised his head and looked at the large round moon out the window, saying slowly after a second, "The history of the Sunset Shrine can be traced back to a long time ago, when the astral beasts invaded. That time was a huge disaster. These beasts of unknown origin defeated almost every legendary being of the plane. They wanted to pour their energy into it, turning it into an astral plane. If the pathway had been constructed, failure would slowly be changed by this energy. Failing to suppress them indirectly, the gods eventually joined the battle personally. Paying a heavy price, they finally managed to kill all the invading astral beasts. Not only did the god of war descend to fight himself, several other gods were injured as well. The one who was injured the most was the Lady of the Night." "The Lady of the Night? Didn't she go missing in that battle?" Richard asked. He had seen written accounts about her in Eshen's diary. The battle with the astral beasts had killed almost all the powerhouses of Phaler, leaving a part of the continent in ruins. A greater god was destroyed, while a number of other deities were injured. A few of those whose injuries were more serious had gone missing. "That isn't the truth. The Lady of the Night did not go missing, the battle caused her to fall. With her divine kingdom damaged, she had no choice but to give up her divinity for a mortal incarnation as she found a way to slowly recover. However, the god of day took the chance to send out his most elite soldiers, successfully killing the Lady of the Night. Once the battle came to an end, the paladins who had done most of the work were found guilty of blasphemy, with orders given out for their capture and execution. One of the gods that gave out this order was the god of day. Richard's mouth twitched slightly. He wanted to ask a question, but he held his tongue. Abandonment and sacrifice were a common act amongst nobles, and apparently it wasn't uncommon between gods either. In both cases, it was always dressed up in a righteous cause. Kellic paused for a while before continuing. The paladins were left with no room for survival. They were originally the god of day's most elite soldiers, and were each granted some divine power to help them kill the Lady of the Night. When they were successful, they had obtained some of her divine power as well. When the gods gave the order to capture and kill them, they ultimately chose to resist. There were a total of 119 paladins. They fought in various corners of the continent for several years, breaking through encirclement countless times through numerous wars both small and big. Because their combined power of day and night, as well as their fallen status, they were called the Warriors of the Sunset Shrine. The entire process of their pursuit was an apocalyptic war that followed right after the battle against the astral beasts. It was only after the last of them died that order was restored. 2 legendary powerhouses had fallen at their hands, and so many saints that it was impossible to count. Battle after battle, a majority of the Sunset Warriors channeled their rage into curses that allowed their powers to be passed down through rituals. Even with the original 119 destroyed, they had scattered their seeds of hatred and vengeance all over the plain. People occasionally awaken the power of the Sunset Shrine, obtaining the powers they passed on. These are the greatest of heretics. Some just pass things on in secret, but many became infamous in the mainland. Some others just go into hiding, secretly choosing to conserve their energy. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 201. Secret of Sunset, 2. Having heard this, Richard asked an important question: why would the god of day want to attack the Lady of the Night? When the Lady of the Night fell, her divinity and power were absorbed by him. This allowed him to jump from a lesser deity to an intermediate one, and at the same time he changed his name. He is now known as the god of time, Rune. This was confidential information. If this was true, it was undoubtedly one of the biggest secrets of the entire plane. If news were to spread, one would definitely arouse Rune's wrath. And judging from how the Sunset Warriors had been treated, it was evident that the gods of Phalar would not like these rumors. Why do you think my guard is from the Sunset Shrine? Look, she's still very weak. Although he knew Phaser wasn't from the Sunset Shrine, Richard was intrigued by this mysterious group Kellic had spoken of. If his words were true, they would be a natural ally to him in Phalar. The only unknown was whether they valued the gods or the plane more. The combination of darkness and divinity. It's a common characteristic of the Sunset Warriors, and a unique one. Divinity was not something just anyone would be allowed to possess. A commoner with divinity was like a beggar with a bag of gold. The gods would undoubtedly intervene. Richard frowned, gently tapping his hand on the table as he asked, "The Sunset Shrine seems to be the primary target of the gods. Since you think my guard is a Sunset Warrior, should I be worried about priests and paladins knocking on my door in the near future?" Kellic's mouth twitched, settling into a bitter smile. The divinity of the Sunset Warriors rests deep in their souls. Even the gods cannot find them. Strong or weak, the only way to sense the existence of a Sunset Warrior is if you are one yourself. Richard was astounded by this revelation. "So you are, Kellic nodded, his gaze returning to Phaser. "Sir Richard, can you hand your guard over to me? I can guide her, and help her realize her true potential as someone of the Sunset Shrine." "Not possible," Richard answered without hesitation. Phaser was the spawn of the Brood Mother. Her darkness came from Sinclair, while her divinity came from various ancestral idols. She was definitely not a Sunset Warrior, so there was no potential for Kellic to bring out. Besides, she was already level 6 now, and would soon be an essential member of his party in the future. How could he hand her over to him? Whatever conditions he was thinking of, there was no room for discussion. Kellic was obviously unhappy. He tried over and over to sound Richard out, but Richard was adamant. He was left with no choice but to drop the subject. "Alright then, Mr. Kellic," Richard changed the topic, "let's discuss that partnership with the demon hunting spears." "No need to worry, my lips are sealed about what I just heard." He glanced at Phaser, who had withdrawn into a corner. "If anything, I will do it for her." Kellic leaned back with a strange smile. "I trust you completely. Now, Sir Richard, what do you want?" Richard got straight to the point. "I'm in urgent need of a dependable group of elite soldiers." Kellic nodded his head, passing a scroll to Richard. "The demon hunting spears have a total of about 700 men, the weakest of us being level 6. They are loyal and trustworthy. This scroll contains details about them and their corresponding rates. However, the key to our partnership is not in gold, but the tainted scrolls you sold to me last time." "The tainted divine scrolls?" Richard had his doubts. He reached out to grab the scroll on offer, starting to inspect its contents. Before Kellic could explain, Flozen suddenly broke her silence. "Was your divine power burnt a long time ago?" Kellic's body shook all of a sudden, leaving him feeling incredulous. He raised his head, his hawk eyes giving Flozen a death stare. The cleric's eyes had turned dark as ink, but deep in her pupils was a pale gold glimmer. He felt as though his very soul had turned crystal clear under her gaze, all his secrets out in the open. He managed to calm himself down quickly. "Indeed. I was once a high priest for the Highland war god, 20 years ago. I offended another deity, and was punished by the burning of my divine power. I was lucky to have survived." Richard suddenly looked up from the scroll and stared at Kellic. "Don't you have to be at least level 16 to be called a high priest?" "I was level 17 at the time." "A level 17 priest surviving the burning of his divine power? It's simply a miracle!" Flozen exclaimed. As a cleric herself, she knew clearly how unbelievable such a thing was. Even a level 7 cleric whose divine power was burned would be left half dead. It was unheard of for someone above level 10 to be able to survive the process. "It's because I was also a sunset warrior. The divinity hidden within saved me at the most crucial moment, but because of that most of my divine power faded away." Kellic laughed bitterly. Flozen's gaze roamed about as she asked, "So then, you need a new religion?" Kellic hesitated. It seemed hard for him to make the decision, but eventually he nodded his head. "My body is currently broken beyond repair, my life almost at an end. If I do not acquire the grace of a new god, I will not live to see the next year. However, I have a few unfulfilled wishes. I need to live on." He only grew more and more resolute as he spoke. "I inspected those tainted scrolls. If I am not wrong, that batch of scrolls came from a new power. This power is not amongst the current pantheon, so it likely comes from a new demigod. If I get the favor of this demigod and a new lease of life on my divine power, I can continue to fulfill my wishes. So long as this new god's requirements do not contradict my wishes, I am willing to serve." Hearing what Kellic had to say, Flozen opened her mouth to speak but was stopped by Richard. Richard looked Kellic in the eye, asking, "What would you offer to your new god?" Kellic had long since been prepared for this question. "I was a powerful priest after all. If I garner the favor of this new god, I will grow very swiftly in level. With enough grace, it is not impossible for me to recover completely. A high priest in the mortal world can be of great use to a new deity. Secondly, outside of my unfulfilled wishes, I will give my body and soul to my new lord. The entirety of my subordinates and the demon hunting spears will be at his disposal, and we will dress in the church's colors. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 202. Refugee. Richard and Flozen looked at each other. Kellic had been an unexpected surprise, a gargantuan one. If all he said was true, and he really could regain his powers as a high priest, he would be a great boon for Richard's growth. Flozan nodded in response to Richard's inquisitive gaze. She could do this. Richard's heart was thus set at ease, and he asked Kellic one last question. Now then, what were those unfulfilled wishes? Kellic fell silent for a while, his face contorting as he recalled unpleasant memories. He eventually let out a long sigh. I wish for the crucifixion and burning of Cardinal Markville of the Highland War God. The Highland War God was a lesser deity, so a cardinal of his would normally be around level 16, maybe level 15 in the best case. Of course, the level was not the biggest problem. Burning a cardinal at the stake was basically declaring a crusade against their deity. Richard continued his questioning, finding out that Markville had originally been a level 17 high priest just like Kellic. The source of their enmity was not important, all he'd needed to know was whether Kellic's wishes contradicted the will of the eternal dragon. Richard nodded his head towards Flozan and she spoke up, the master I serve, his name is the Dragon of Eternity and Light. What? Kellic involuntarily cried out. He immediately realized that he had lost his self-control, but the name that Flozan uttered was far too shocking. If this was really the god's title, then it wasn't some new demigod but a deity whose powers transcended Phalar itself. The Book of the Gods ensured that Kellic was well aware of the deeper systems of the plane. He knew the laws of Phalar would not allow for such a powerful god to exist. If Flozan was telling the truth, there was only one possibility. However, she could not be lying, because that was a meaningless act. He would naturally feel the presence of this new god when he converted. Kellic's mouth contorted and his voice suddenly grew hoarse, the Dragon of Eternity and Light. This is a god from a different plane. Not a different plane, Flozan corrected him, he reigns supreme over many. Kellic inhaled a deep breath, but there is essentially no difference. You lot are invaders. Yes, we come from another plane. However, a majority of the pantheon on Phalar won't accept you, Flozan pointed out harshly. She had some understanding of Phalar's gods by now. Kellic painfully closed his eyes, his face warping. He was already prepared when he spoke the truth about the Sunset Shrine, prepared even before he took a step through the door. He knew there would be a bumpy road ahead, where he could follow a new deity's transcendence or even witness the blasphemy of killing a god. However, the truth was always more frightening than what one expected. This unbelievably mighty god would allow his wishes to come to fruition easier, but these invaders clashed with his beliefs. It was an extremely difficult decision to make. It took a long struggle before he finally spoke again. Yes, indeed. I am willing to worship the Dragon of Eternity and Light. Having said that, he leaned back into his chair, sweating profusely. He looked very weak, as though he was suffering from a grave illness. Flozan stood up, a stern expression on her face. You will not be disappointed. Follow me, we can start the ceremony now. The ceremony was held in Flozan's room. The altar was a piece of wood that had been nailed crudely to a wooden frame, the workmanship shoddy. Carson Marvin served as assistants, while Richard was the only spectator. Flozan placed the Book of Time on the wood, giving Kellic a quick summary of the Eternal Dragon's teachings, his domain, and his blessings. The old dragon's teachings were actually quite simple, with almost no specifics. In other words, there were no lengthy codices to solidify the religion, most of the information passed on being related to sacrifices and blessings. These teachings truly left Kellic surprised, but after seeing the cold divine might being emitted by the Book of Time he immediately turned serious. Every type of power in nature could be fabricated, but not the power of the gods. A faint gold glimmer started flowing from the Book of Time under the melodious sound of Flozan's chants. She motioned for Kellic to step forward, kneeling in front of the Book of Time and stretching out his hands to receive the divine power. Kellic was so excited his entire body started trembling as he complied with all her instructions. The pale gold glimmer exploded onto Kellic's hands like a rain of gold. His body immediately shook as he felt a cold, metallic divine power roll through his body. His dry, cracked soul screamed, absorbing the divine power that it had not seen for a long time. The wounds to his soul slowly closed up. The ash black on Kelleck's face was washed away by the cleansing might, the face that resembled an old tree bark slowly swelling up as several deep wrinkles flattened out. All his bones started crackling, his body growing in size. Kelleck was completely transformed by the divine power, and his powers were returning just as quickly. It wasn't long before he had passed level 10, and he didn't seem to show any signs of slowing down. Small beads of sweat had started forming on Flosan's forehead, but she continued the constant chant, controlling the sparks flying out from the Book of Time towards Kelleck's hands. This process was taking longer than expected, but it was also the most important. It was only now that Kelleck would grow so quickly. Once the ceremony came to an end, he would have to regain his power bit by bit like anyone else. As long as he could absorb the power of time, she had to persist. The pale gold energy had slowly spread to Kelleck's waist, covering the top half of his body. A blinding glow suddenly radiated from his shirt, seemingly plating the entire room in gold. For a moment, it seemed like that gold glimmer had absorbed all the power of time. The portion of his shirt quickly turned dark, decaying into ashes. This was the power of time. It might not be as violent as a burning flame, but its might was unstoppable. Who could weather the passage of time? All of Kelleck's clothes were corroded in an instant. Some expensive magical artifacts, including powerful scrolls, could not resist the flow of time and were completely destroyed. The only exception was a small scroll, which instead of fading away started to absorb more and more power from its surroundings. It turned red hot, eventually looking like a brand that burnt a part of Kelleck's skin in the blink of an eye. He was forced to retreat involuntarily, but the scroll remained in its original position, floating in mid-air. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 203. The Sight of Divine Grace. Richard watched the scroll that was burning with the power of time with a look of shock. He could faintly feel that the material was similar to what the Book of Holding was made of, able to withstand the erosion of time. On the other hand, Flosan looked at the scroll with surprise. She even stopped in the middle of her chant, quickly asking Kelleck, "What is this?" Kelleck endured the pain that came from the power of time altering his body, speaking with clenched teeth, "This is the Book of the Gods. It has records of the divine power of almost every true god in Phalar's pantheon. It is a divine artifact left behind by the Sunset Shrine. The gods of Phalar regard its owner to be the greatest heretic on the plane. You must be careful, do not open it. It can only be opened without the gods noticing through a special method and spell." Flosan reached out and took the scroll, ignoring Kelleck's advice as she opened the scroll. Her amber eyes released constant ripples of pale gold, the power of time binding the divine auras without letting any spill out. Carefully reading through it from cover to cover, Flosan asked, "This is how you figured out that my tainted scrolls didn't come from Phalar's gods?" "That's right," Kelleck nodded his head. The Book of the Gods was still continuously absorbing the power of time. Even though Flosan was not singing anymore, pale gold light still poured out of the Book of Time as though it was drawn by the scroll. Flosan's eyes grew brighter and brighter, and in the end she spoke to Kelleck in a stately, solemn voice, "The Book of the Gods would not be a bad offering to the eternal dragon. Sacrifice it to him, and you will receive a divine gift." "So, Kelleck, are you willing to offer the Book of the Gods to the eternal dragon?" To a devout worshipper, this would be something that went without saying. However, Kelleck struggled for a long time before expressing his will to offer it. That was how precious the Book of the Gods was to him. The Book of the Gods was the only reason Kelleck remained above level 10 even though his divine power had been burnt. At the same time, it was the origin of the power of many of the heretic clerics under him. They were not true unbelievers, just people who shifted the target of their faith to the Book of the Gods. Because the book contained the divine power of Phalar's gods, it could also faintly accept the power of faith and bestow divine power in return. Of course, it could not compare to a real god, or even a demigod for that matter, but this ability still gave it the right to be called a divine tool. With Kelleck's consent, Flozan started another incantation. The light coming from the Book of Time suddenly grew 10 times as intense, the intense pale gold converging into what seemed like a solid pillar that shone straight towards the ceiling. However, it seemed to hit an invisible barrier near the top and quietly disappear. It wasn't just the ceiling, even if the entire room was filled with the power of time, not a bit spilt out. The Book of the Gods bobbed up and down within that pillar of time, slowly falling towards the Book of Time until it eventually became a single page that turned into a part of the book. A distant and desolate aura, one with an indescribable imposition, suddenly descended upon the room. This was the will of the eternal dragon. Although it hadn't descended with its actual body, this will was no weaker than the one in the Church of the Eternal Dragon. This was a great sacrifice that satisfied the Eternal Dragon, enough that its will crossed an unknown amount of spacetime to absorb the offering and bestow a blessing. With the dragon's aura pervading the room, the never-ending light pouring out of the Book of Time grew even more turbulent. It all converged together, eventually condensing into 2 pale gold balls of light that floated in the air. 3 smaller points of gold floated up and down nearby. Watching the balls of light floating in the air, Kelleck suddenly felt a dryness in his mouth. His heart almost leapt out of his chest, as he clearly felt that one of these balls belonged to him. It was very likely that it hid what he had dreamed of for so many years, that Flozan's unique hoarse voice rang out once more, startling Kelleck from his reverie. "Kelleck, the Eternal Dragon is very satisfied with your sacrifice, so he exerted a great deal of divine power to break through the plane seal, bestowing a generous gift upon you. Go, take that which is yours." Kelleck took a deep breath, stretching his hand out towards the ball of light that was his. The sudden influx of information almost stopped his heart. Divine blessing, spring of life. For 30 years, his body would not age. Kelleck immediately understood the significance of this blessing. It was an additional 30 years of life. No god in Phalar's history could extend their worshippers' lives. There were other ways to prolong life, like becoming a lich, but there was nothing that did not require a great sacrifice. A longer life gave one the chance to make miracles happen. Once the spring of life took effect, the ball of light dimmed until it was only a tenth as bright as before. However, the power of time still surged into Kelleck's body. By the time it disappeared completely, he was already a level 13 fallen cleric. Outside of the spring of life, this was another divine gift. Divine blessing, excitation. It was a gift bestowed upon priests of the Eternal Dragon, using the power of time to immediately increase their power anywhere between 1 and 3 levels. At the same time as he had received the much-needed spring of time, the remaining divine grace had raised Kelleck's power by 2 levels. The other ball of light belonged to Flozan. The sacrifice had left the Eternal Dragon very satisfied, so the cleric who conducted the ceremony would also gain a certain amount of divine grace. This was the fastest method for those of the Church of the Eternal Dragon to raise their level. However, when Flozan reached out to touch the ball of light, she started to hesitate. Before her were a number of options for the blessing, but she could only choose one. She quickly filtered out most of the options, but could not make a choice between 2. One was the same blessing Kelleck had been bestowed, excitation, while the other, eternal passage would strengthen the Book of Time. The divine grace that was supposed to belong to her would be transformed into a pure power of time that could be absorbed by the Book of Time, increasing its powers. The most visible effect was that it would become easier to communicate with the Eternal Dragon, and any spells that used the Book of Time would be strengthened. Looking at it from the point of view of strengthening herself, Flozan's choice would naturally be excitation. This blessing would immediately allow her to grow 3 levels. Although Eternal Passage could also increase the might of her spells, it was nowhere near as effective. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 204. The Sight of Divine Grace, 2. However, Flozin knew that Eternal Passage I had two more hidden effects. One of them allowed her to gain more grace during sacrifices. As her channel to the Eternal Dragon grew more stable, the loss of power during a sacrifice would naturally decrease. The other was that it could transform the Book of Time into a proper altar in the future, one that could replace the Lighthouse of Time. If the Core of Time blessing was used to further enhance the Book of Time, it would become a temporary lighthouse. As the Book of Time continued to strengthen, it would be granted a special gift from the Eternal Dragon, the coordinates of a primary plane. She could go back to Norland. Although they could only build a temporary passageway that had limited effectiveness, it was a way back home. Looking at the dozens of other gifts on the list, Flozin could not help but clench her teeth. It wasn't like the remaining options were useless, but Excitation and Eternal Passageway I were the most effective in their current situation where they were lost amongst the myriad planes. Other circumstances would have made some of these gifts equally attractive or even better. For example, the gift of wisdom would permanently improve one's intellect. A commoner could become a genius, while a genius would become a polymath. The blessing would immediately place her on the same level as Richard. Another example was the divine gift, reincarnation. It was a set of weapons that could trigger the power of time. This was a set, not a single piece. Even the current Flozin would be as strong as a level 18 high priest if she wore the set. Flozin had obtained a limited amount of divine grace, and she could only exchange it for the weakest component of the set, the necklace of spring. Even that she could not get a whole version of, only a flawed piece that could just slightly increase the effect of time-related techniques. It also slowed down the wearer's aging slightly, and had a supplementary grade 4 healing spell that could be used up to thrice a day. However, Flozin could see all the components of reincarnation in the list, especially their effects. She was left clenching her teeth again. Another attraction was the divine gift, Heavenly Guardian. It would form a divine warrior from the power of time to act as the guard of the recipient. Heavenly Guardians were not puppets, they had wisdom comparable to human geniuses, but their loyalty to their master was unshakable. They would start around level 12, able to grow to level 16 through battle or divine power. There were further stages to this gift, increasing the number of guardians and the limit to their level. One could obtain a loyal level 20 guard after choosing it thrice. If there was sufficient grace, the conductor could even obtain an entire troop of level 20 guardians. Even many normal legendary powerhouses would not willingly provoke such a group. If only there were sufficient divine grace. Flozin clenched her teeth even tighter, the sound of grinding teeth audible to everyone present. "What's wrong?" Richard asked, sensing the change in her. We're too poor," she said through gritted teeth. "Poor?" Richard was puzzled. Flozin's chest heaved rapidly. She simply closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she fiercely chose Eternal Passageway I. When she opened her eyes and looked at Richard again, a murderous aura was flowing out of her. Richard grew even more confused, but past experience told him that now was not the time to ask. The sentence was still lingering around in Flozin's head, if only there were sufficient divine grace. The Church of the Eternal Dragon was accustomed to extensions of life as a measure of divine grace. The divine grace needed to summon a heavenly guardian was enough to prolong one's life for an extra 15 years. This required a sacrifice that was comparable to a greater devil. The majority of greater devils were at or above level 18, and at least 3 were needed for a level 20 guardian. Devils were not sheep, they could not be caught as one wished. Even Gatton treasured the greater devil's skull he possessed. However, if 5 more greater devils could be offered up, the guardian could be raised by another level to level 21. This was crossing from the saint realm to become a legendary being. A mere 9 greater devils could be exchanged for a legendary guard. The sacrificer would benefit greatly in this exchange. Flozin could not remain calm any longer, her breath growing heated at the thought of a legendary guard. What happened? Richard could not help but ask again. The rest of her retinue were shocked by the formidable power of their god. Not knowing Flozin well enough, they only felt their young leader's expression grew more solemn, not noticing the undercurrents. "You don't know!" Flozin raged, leaving Richard bewildered. She could not pay attention to his feelings right now. She was roaring in her heart, as though an ancient beast had emerged from deep within her. "Don't let me see it! You damned old coot! You obviously knew what I needed, and you know I don't have so much divine grace. Why did you let me see so many gifts? Do I have to collect offerings my entire life, living for you? Damn you! But... ugh, I really want those things. Fine, you win. You damned old dragon, curse you!" Regardless of her cursing, the eternal dragon would last through all time, unmoved by her anger. Even if she dedicated all of the world's most malicious words his way, she still had to work obediently to collect more offerings and sacrifice them to him. The many options were a habit of the eternal dragon. How could one not be motivated to collect offerings when they saw what they could get? People always believed in themselves, and always had desires. Flozin was no exception. If anything, her desires were even stronger. The more capable and talented one was, the more they wanted to obtain things that were hard to reach. A new imprint of an hourglass appeared on the cover of Book of Time after it absorbed the divine grace, while the Book of the Gods became one of its pages. The ribbons of light representing the power of the various deities of Phalar still populated the page. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 205. Future. As the ceremony was coming to an end, the three pale spots of light entered Kars, Marvin, and Richard. Kars and Marvin had assisted with the ceremony, contributing their own divine power to allow for the communication with the eternal dragon. They received a small amount of grace in return, allowing them to grow by one level to get to level 9. However, a mere bystander like Richard receiving a little of the grace left Flozin unable to help but feel indignant. He even received a time-related blessing, even though it was to a lesser degree. Divine blessing, dewdrop of life. His body would not age for an extra 6 months. 6 months? You can do a lot with just 6 months. If there were 30 dues, Flozin thought angrily, converting things to divine grace once more. Of course, her expression was still tranquil, even solemn. When Kellic left the room, he looked like a middle-aged man once more. His skin even shone with a pale gold luster. The enormous divine grace had not been fully absorbed yet, so he would need a few more days to look like an ordinary person once more. He wrapped himself completely with a hooded robe, leaving just as quietly as he came. Back at level 13, Kellic now qualified to be called a priest even in Norland. There were many mass buffs amongst grade 6 divine spells, so his presence greatly boosted the strength of Richard's army. Of course, Richard had also accepted an enemy of a high priest of the Highland war god, perhaps even the whole church. Of course, as an invader was the natural enemy of all the gods of Phalar, there was no difference whether he offended them greatly or just a little. He left that very night, going to the demon hunting spears to bring over all the troops directly under him, also looking to see if he could hire the rest as well. He had 70 elites and 15 unbelievers under him, the latter of which would soon become followers of the eternal dragon. They did not have the problem of changing their faith, so unlike a fallen priest like Kellic, they would become proper clerics. Richard didn't care about the dewdrop of life at all. However, the knowledge that it was worth 1/30 of a greater devil told him that this drop was not so easy to obtain. With his current power, any greater devil could defeat him with ease. Besides, he just stood by the side watching the ceremony and still obtained some grace. That fact just made Flozin angrier. Although this beautiful cleric was a titled member of the church, this was still her first time taking charge of such an important ritual by herself. That meant it was also the first time she had seen so many options for divine gifts. The sheer number of treasures blinded her for a moment, turning her into a kind of shopaholic. Her list of wants was so long the end could not be seen, so every drop of divine grace was extremely important. However, that small gift showed how much value the eternal dragon attached to Richard. The process of absorbing the grace this time was much shorter, and Richard was also used to the surging power of time. However, numerous colorful ribbons of light flashed past him during the process. Previously, he would have thought this was just a normal phenomenon when one was absorbing divine grace. However, now that he had read the Book of Time once, he felt like it was familiar. Something seemed to be hidden in those rays of light, so he used all his energy and called upon both his blessings to maximize the speed of his thought. He was trying to find a way to catch what was hidden behind that glow. With the upgraded blessings of wisdom and truth, Richard's perception was already equal to that of a saint. He finally managed to see the scenes behind that veil of light, just that there were far too many flashing by at a time. Almost 1,000 different images crossed his sight per second, not something ordinary men could catch. Richard's heart beat wildly as he tried his best, but still he only managed to catch a few scenes with difficulty. Even then it was all blurred out, so much so that he could barely distinguish silhouettes. But when he organized the afterimages in his memory and saw these scenes clearly, Richard suddenly felt his entire body freeze. Flozin still had a lot of work to wrap up the ceremony. By the time she was done with everything, it was already night. The exhausted cleric headed to Richard's room, only to see him stood still before the large map while deep in thought. His face was as dark as murky water. She sat behind him without a word. The two had their own worries, each immersed in their own world. The room was quiet, one could hear the beating of hearts, and time quietly slipped by in the stillness. By the time they somewhat broke out of their reveries, 2 hours had passed. Richard seemed to have set his mind on something, pounding his fist heavily on the map. Flozin got up and stood behind him, looking at the map to see that the fist had crushed the marker of a slave camp. This camp belonged to Red Cossack and wasn't far from Blue Water, an important interchange point in the Cossack slave trade. Flozin frowned. The raid on Red Cossack's caravan could still be passed off as revenge for their attempt on his life, but an ambush against their slave camp would strike them at their weakness. They would be forced to confront him head-on, leading to an inevitable all-out battle between the two parties. A plan was developed atop blood and bodies. Flozin was not a naive girl, she had a mind to completely eliminate Red Cossack as well, but the chief issue was time. "Aren't you being a little impatient?" she asked. It was not wise to make too many enemies at the same time. Richard did not answer, clearly still conflicted. The surprise attack could buy them some time, but the benefits were not worth the risk. They were both blessed by the eternal dragon, time was forever on their side. Flozin. I saw some blurry scenes when absorbing the divine grace. What do they mean? Richard asked. Flozin was startled, growing serious as she asked, were they clear? Richard hesitated for a moment. No, it was incredibly blurred. I could only see that something was happening, but couldn't tell who was involved at all. Oh, Flozin didn't continue to press for details, instead explaining, the divine grace of the eternal dragon is a condensation of the power of time. Thus, your mind and soul could enter the river of time when absorbing it, getting a premonition of possible events in the future. A premonition of the future? Richard's expression changed greatly. Still looking down at the map, Flozin did not notice his unusual expression. She just nodded, saying, what you absorbed was the power of time, so there's a chance to see the future. However, you need to be a saint at minimum to actually distinguish what you see. You don't have that ability right now. The rune was very dimly lit. Flozin herself had not broken through her own worry, so she was too absent-minded to notice how unusually pale Richard's face was. She did not think he already had the ability to get a rudimentary glimpse of these scenes. Most of what he saw was blood-soaked campaigns through foreign plains. Even in the most desperate of situations, his will was indomitable. However, two specific ones left him feeling like he had fallen into the abyss. One was of a pitch-black void. Sharon was floating in the empty space, devoid of all signs of life. The other was 5 years later, where Mountainsea waved goodbye to him and walked forward without looking back. In front of her was a sea of enemies, like a sea of oppressive black. Looking at the map once more, Richard's gaze grew so cold it could burn. If this was an inevitability, that only meant he needed to take a more active role. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 206. Future, 2. The vision of the future was like a massive mountain crushing Richard's heart, leaving him unable to even smile. The joy from a powerhouse like Kellic joining his side was completely washed away by this looming fate. For some reason, he couldn't disregard these visions even if they were only a slight possibility. He had achieved greatness at a young age. Few throughout Norland could better him at his age. Landing alone in a powerful secondary plane, cut off from reinforcements, he had quickly gotten himself together and become a qualified leader. However, throughout his life, even including when he had learnt about the nightmare creatures, this was the most despair he had ever felt. He was left wondering what kind of fate was recorded in the scenes he could not capture. The feeling of knowing the future but only being able to see small bits of it was truly terrible. A dim light shone over the large table with the map, the glow only going an inch beyond its bounds. The moonlight from the window was the only main source of light, so the room was shrouded in shades of black and gray. Richard was sitting quietly, his back drawing random lines on the wall behind him. His heart now thirsted for strength more than ever. No matter how he thought about it, the best method to prevent that future was to offer sacrifices to the eternal dragon in exchange for great power. He would use the broodmother as a great tool of war, having her twist the outcome of his battles. Magic crystals, divine items, and food were a constant investment into her strength. In other words, the broodmother's power came from gold. And be it items to sacrifice or gold to buy with, war was the quickest way to obtain either. With his mind made up, the rest of the matters would be dealt with. Richard looked up and spoke to Flozin. Can you tell me about the gifts of the eternal dragon? It's best if you tell me every variety you know. Flozin snapped back from her own world of thought, nodding in reply. The dragon of eternity and light has countless gifts on offer. Everyone can be granted different things, his will changes based on the situation of the offerer. However, there are a few large categories: time, divine weapons, abilities, and domains among others. He adjusts the range of gifts based on the offerer's greatest needs, and picks one at random from that range. This is merely the law of luck in play. Luck is a part of one's power, after all. A lucky fellow could get what he wants each time, while an unlucky one would have to aim for what they want through multiple ceremonies and sacrifices. Now, I can only tell you the gifts I know of. Time-related ones are the rarest of the lot. Every living being instinctively wishes for immortality. The eternal dragon had innumerable gifts to give. Flozin alone could list hundreds, and as she summarized each one, the carriage of time unknowingly made its way till midnight. Richard analyzed how best he could combine these gifts as he listened, using them to develop most effectively. By this point, he didn't care for what needed to be sacrificed anymore. Just like Flozin had said, luck was a sovereign law that surpassed planes. The eternal dragon had harsh requirements for offerings, and one required luck to gather objects to sacrifice. Once Flozin was done with the last type of gift, he brushed her hair and chuckled, "Enough, go to bed. It's already very late. We have to make sure we're alert, we will be fighting again tomorrow." Flozin pursed her lips and hummed, "What a fake smile. If you don't feel like smiling, then don't." However, she did not ask Richard why he was so down all of a sudden. If he was going to keep quiet, then that would be the end of it. The two stripped out of their clothes and got into bed, but did nothing more than cuddle. Richard gazed at the ceiling quietly, devoid of all thought. Flozin lay in his embrace as she listened to his heartbeat, her mind a bitter blank as well. That sleepless night, the pair of young man and woman seemed to have matured slightly. When the first light of morning shone through the window, Flozin leapt up and pinched Richard. "Hey, you lazy bum. Get out of bed, we're still fighting a war today. Tell me, who are we robbing? Richard awoke without hurry in front of the girl who was glimmering with enthusiasm, wearing his clothes before he suddenly grabbed her. He stared into her eyes and planted a light kiss on her lips, pinching her face hard. Your smile's pretty fake too. Putting on her robes, Flozen immediately left for her own room to get her equipment, checking her scrolls and making preparations for battle. In the meanwhile, Richard stood in front of the morning sun for a long time as he watched the chaotic yet exuberant blue water oasis. He was deep in thought, with no hurry to gather his army and set off. War was a double-edged sword. It could destroy one's enemies, but it would also harm oneself. The volcano in his heart was already on the verge of erupting, but he was in no hurry to act. Instead, after just standing there for an hour or so, he simply returned to his room and pondered in the silence. If those truly were visions of the future, it was even more important that he stay prudent and calm now. The long river of fate was an indomitable existence, meandering through the myriad planes. Regardless of why he had seen that specific image, it was only a possibility of the future that was not fixed. The river was not a single current, instead a mix of countless small flows that covered the past, present, and future. Given his current strength, he could not compare to a drop of water within that huge river. In other words, a lack of caution could leave him dead before those scenes ever played out. When that moment in fate arrived, he would have lost the right to participate. Even though everything around him looked peaceful, Richard knew it was actually quite dangerous. Although his army had accomplished many miracles, they were only performed while dancing on a razor's edge. Outdoing those stronger than him was only a last resort, and there was a limit to how much he could do himself. The moment he met a saint, he would face extreme danger. Even if he could overwhelm his enemy with numbers, it would require a devastating price. A single wrong step would completely end this army with limitless prospects. Whether he could change the future or not, he wanted to be there. If he were to just die before even accomplishing that, everything else would just be empty talk. First, he had to return to Norland. Only a fool would be innocent enough to want to use this army to take over all of Failure. The road back was already halfway paved. Flozen had obtained the Eternal Passage blessing. All that was left was the Core of Time. The key now was enough of a sacrifice to acquire it. However, that did not need to come through war alone. There were still many other methods, like trade, cheating, or persuasion. And he had enough items on hand for trades. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 207. Collaboration. It took the entire morning before Richard managed to walk out of his room. Gathering a few desert warriors, he brought Ola and Phaser along and left Blue Water Oasis, hastening towards the Red Cossack camp. 10 kilometers away from the slave camp, he came to a stop. The information he'd gotten from his friends told him this was the furthest the camp's sentinels would patrol. He waited patiently until night fell, sending out the enhanced elite bats. They circled the sky above the slave camp, using their night vision to give him a clear understanding of the camp's defensive layout. This was an enormous camp, with nearly 8,000 imprisoned slaves. There was an army of 500 watching over them, with a stable not far away. Interactions between two guards as well as the routes of the patrols gave him an estimate of about 300 cavalrymen guarding the outer perimeter. His robbing that second-class caravan had caused them to strengthen their defenses for a while. Having figured out the situation, Richard silently left and returned to Blue Water. When he knocked on Amon's door, it was already late into the night. The old man was still at the grocery store, running his ordinary little shop. Foreigners would not be able to tell that this wizened old man was someone who could influence the entire oasis. Seeing that it was Richard at the door, Amon was slightly surprised. However, he didn't say anything as he allowed the mage to enter. A few moments later, he brought over a pot of tea and a plate of refreshments, pouring 2 cups and sitting calmly in front of Richard as he waited for a reason for the visit. For his part, Richard did not hesitate. I'll be obtaining a batch of slaves soon, and I need my hands off them as soon as possible. How many, and which race? Aman asked without a change in expression. A little more than 8,000. Nearly 4,000 each of desert people and dwarves, with a few hundred wild elves, dark elves, and barbarians. The elves and barbarians aren't males. Aman gazed at Richard with profound meaning in his eyes. You are too anxious. It's a lack of confidence, Richard answered calmly. If we can work together, I'll be 80% confident. We can't just act when we're merely 10% confident, can we? 80%? You really are quite self-confident, Aman chuckled, but it's a good thing for young people to be confident. I'll take it as 60%. Do you need Lord Rolf's support? Yes, Richard nodded. Red Cossack has 2 saints. While they're not from the bloodstained lands, it's hard enough for me to deal with one right now, Aman took a small sip of black tea and said gently, contending against saints is no small matter. Have you prepared enough? We can split Red Cossack halfway. It should be worth the cost. Indeed, that's not small, Aman muttered to himself. But then, he slowly continued, the worth of battles between saints cannot be measured in gold. Victory is often more important, so Lord Rolf might be very careful in considering this. Richard immediately understood what Aman was getting at. The 2 saints in charge of Red Cossack were the same as Rolf, level 16. It was hard to say who would win even in a one-on-one matchup. Aman was implying that he wasn't confident in Rolf's chances against them. If the Sword Saint lost, then Richard would have even fewer chances of victory against them. Rolf likely wouldn't want to step into these murky waters, regardless of how much Richard had on offer. However, Richard only wanted Rolf to stall the Red Cossack saints. He had quite a few spellcasters on his side, making it a powerful army based on Phaler's standards. The cleric's buffs on Rolf would make him so powerful the enemy would be ashamed. On the other hand, all sorts of curses would assault the enemies, forcing them to use more energy. On top of all this, the Sword Saint had bought a rune from him before. Unless the opponents were 2 levels higher, they were bound to lose. Flosan's Lens of Time, in particular, could grant a definite kill if she was successful. But he obviously couldn't go about revealing his trump cards. He had far too many secrets that nobody knew of. He would never show all of his cards when making a deal. Thankfully, there were other methods. He lifted the teacup and drank a mouthful. Mr. Kellick already has a new religion. He has decided to forge ahead by my side, and I will help him fulfill the wishes he has held for so many years. Aman startled. This information was out of his expectations and reminded him that backing Richard was a new demigod. No, the fact that Kellick had already converted implied that this existence was only a step away from igniting their godfire, becoming a true deity. Right now, he was likely condensing a divine domain. With a backer like that, it was no wonder that Richard had the guts to attack the violent Red Cossack. Kellick had been a good friend of Aman's for many years. That was exactly why Richard had used him right at the start. It's great that he found a new faith, the old man muttered to himself, but he doesn't have many years left. He probably cannot be of much help to you. Richard smiled lightly. He's actually doing quite well now. It won't be an issue for him to live another 2 decades. What? Aman was shocked. That's impossible. I know his situation well. Even if he has the divine power of a new god poured into him, it will only extend his life by 2 or 3 years. He will return in a few days. You'll know his situation when you see him. Richard put the cup down, tossing out his second card without any hurry. If Lord Rolf is willing to pay a certain price, and he trusts me enough, I can help him overcome his enemies. Asterisk crash, asterisk the teacup in Aman's hands fell to the ground, shattering into bits. The old man still hadn't recovered from the surprise about Kellick's lifespan, and this shock had left him without control of himself. His experience told him that the entity backing Richard had to be something incredible. The boy's words surprised him so greatly that he did not even have the time to bother with the shattered cup or his damp robes. His voice shook slightly as he asked, "Do you mean your rune can help Lord Rolf jump levels? If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 208. Collaboration 2. It should be possible. My mentor just made a breakthrough and finished a new piece that is unmatched. However, both creation and activation use up large amounts of magic crystals. The rune can only be used twice as well, Richard said calmly. Amon tried to suppress the excitement he was feeling, but he could not contain his emotions as he exclaimed repeatedly, "Unimaginable, unimaginable." Only equipment close to the caliber of a divine weapon could possibly raise the power of a saint by an entire level. If it could be used twice, this new rune by Richard's mentor could be called a quasi-divine weapon. In a crucial moment, it granted the wearer 2 additional lives. Having learnt of this, Amon couldn't care less about Richard's lengthy explanation that had a string of technical terms. Nor did he pay attention about the materials needed to activate it. No number of magic crystals was too much for a prospective divine weapon. There could be a drastic difference in the power of 2 saints, even if they were both level 16. Various factors like equipment, skill, energy type, experience, and talent came into play, all affecting the outcome of a battle in some way or the other. Although the 2 saints of Red Cossack were only level 16, they had been born commoners who only advanced to their level through the endless flames of massacre. They were now known as battle maniacs who were no different from normal level 17 fighter. Rolf had lost more often than he won against them. However, his chances of victory would be boosted to about 70 to 80% if his power could be boosted by an entire level. That would be enough. He could go all out as long as he was 70% sure of the outcome. Someone able to become a saint would not lack even that amount of courage. To Rolf, this wasn't just a matter of defeating 2 opponents. It was the experience of wielding the power of someone a level higher than him, something that would be greatly beneficial to his own advancement in the future. Every level once one became a saint was extremely difficult to cross. Amon immediately made up his mind, "Alright. If your rune really is that effective, I can promise you right away that Lord Rolf will become a resolute ally in your fight against Red Cossack, but..." The interests involved in this matter were so major that it was no longer necessary to inform Rolf beforehand. Amon knew the Saint Swordsman extremely well, and that he would have no room for hesitation at all. He did not suspect the capabilities of Richard's mentor either. He had always been paying attention to any news related to the youth, and although there were a lot of secrets, the knowledge of the existence of runes was extremely handy. He managed to find out about Richard selling an entire batch to the Direwolf Duke through his channels, and if these things were beginning to show up en masse, then the crafting style and quality had to be stabilizing. Naturally, that meant more formidable products would follow. Richard passed a list to Amon. "In that case, this is the list of materials needed to equip and activate the rune. Also, forgive me, but some extra materials were added to keep things confidential. They're roughly worth the cost of the basic components of the rune that I already have." The old man had no objection to this. Any mage would ask for more materials than they needed when manufacturing for someone else. That way, they could prevent others from figuring out how their artifacts were made. "I hope to receive them in a week's time. It will take about 10 days or so to process, and Lord Rolf should need a few more days after that to get used to it. Time is tight. Looking through the numerous items on the list, Amon couldn't help but inhale sharply. The things on this list are worth 200,000 coins at minimum. 200,000 coins for 2 chances to defeat formidable opponents. It isn't expensive at all. Gold can be earned again, but the opportunity to obtain great power does not come frequently. The old man nodded gravely. Richard was right. It was impossible to buy a chance to defeat a saint with even 2 million coins, forget 200,000. He scrutinized the list once more. "Time is rather tight, but I will make sure these materials are in your hands in 5 days. However, can the crafting time be reduced?" The Red Cossack saints could be here any time. Richard shook his head. I'll be the one crafting the rune. 10 days is already the lowest it can go. You should know my mentor took an entire 2 months to finish the basic components. Besides, even for it to be done in 10 days, there can be no flaw in the quality of the materials you give me. The higher the quality, the faster I finish. In this case, the old man creased his brows, hesitating a moment before speaking up. I suggest you speak with Devon as well. The conflict between the Golden Warflag and Red Cossack is only growing, and that old fatty is always interested in anything that hurts them. However, it won't be easy to convince him. If the Golden Warflag is willing to stand by our side, things will be a lot easier to handle. They have 2 saints themselves, and Lord Fulcow will be able to rush over very quickly. Richard thought it over for a moment before replying, all right, I'll go talk to him. I believe he will join our side. Only half an hour later, Richard met the large man in his dazzlingly furnished hall. Devon had fallen asleep a short while ago, and he did not seem too pleased with Richard interrupting his dreams. The only reason he had even gotten out of his warm and cozy bed was Richard's dual identity as a runemaster's disciple and a great mage. He shifted himself onto the spacious sofa, letting out a huge yawn before he spoke. Dear Richard, you must have some good news to make up for the precious sleep I lost. Me, you, and Aman, what say we divide Red Cossack up? Richard's voice wasn't loud, but it caused Devon's eyes to widen in an instant. The man's enormous figure leapt up from the sofa immediately, and he pointed at Richard and began a little incoherently. You? Why, you crazy? This is impossible. If it was someone else speaking such words, Devon would have thrown them out long ago. However, Richard was an extremely young great mage. Anything a great mage said ought to be taken seriously. They were people who combined talent, power, and wisdom in a single package. Their judgment was rarely wrong. You don't have to pay a huge price. Just call Lord Fulcow over to Bluewater to keep watch for a few days, and back me up with some soldiers or battle slaves. Explain. In detail. Devon was already devoid of all sleepiness, gazing at Richard with bright eyes. But if you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 209. Desires. Devon had already agreed to join hands with Aman, seeking more power in Bluewater's new order together, but that was nowhere nearly as crazy as Richard's plan. The mage wanted to kick Red Cossack out, a group that held a fourth of the influence in the oasis on the whole. When Richard explained the details, Devon immediately pointed out 2 problems. Even if Lord Fulcow was here, both he and Rolf would not be a match for the 2 saints of Red Cossack. But let's ignore that for a moment. Say we can hold up the opponent's saints. Can you sweep away all of Red Cossack's forces? These men are known throughout the bloodstained lands for their ruthlessness and ferocity. Richard smiled calmly. I have a solution to the first problem, at some cost of course. As for the second. Yes, I can. The fellow's eyes sparkled. Interesting. He said as he rubbed his hands together, interesting. And thus, the deal with Devon was sealed. The fatty had his own logic to things. If Richard could convince Aman of the feasibility of this operation, then he would trust the boy as well. The mage already had great military successes that inspired confidence, and the Golden Warflag was not afraid of Red Cossack anyway. Fulcow definitely wasn't as good as the opponent's saints, but Lord Trey, who was handling affairs elsewhere, could destroy one of them without issue. The contract was thus finalized, but it still required some steps on Richard's part to bring it into effect. The mage needed to bring back thousands of slaves as proof of his power. Neither Aman nor Devon considered Richard's current army to be worth even a mention. Although they didn't want to force the cards from this friend's hand, he still needed to prove his ability on the field if he wanted to ally with them. When the sun rose the next morning, Richard and his entire army took off for the slave camp. The sun was setting when he returned to Bluewater, an enormous group trailing behind him. Although there were less than 8,000 slaves, the number wasn't too far off. The group looked magnificent from a distance, the 1,000-strong army at the helm looking extremely weak in comparison. The 8,000 slaves all entered Blue Water, alarming almost everyone within. Many were still unaware of the origin of these slaves, but any fool could understand the benefits they represented. Most people were envious, some even thinking of snatching the batch of slaves away. However, the appearance of both Devon and Aman in a welcoming position caused the restless crowd to calm down. Only a small number of people could see what was really going on. The composition of Richard's army spoke roughly of their marching speed. Given how long it would take to travel to and from the battlefield, and adding in the time it would have taken to reorganize the slaves, one would come up with an astonishing duration for the battle. Richard's friends were stood side by side, unable to help but glance at each other to notice the shock in their eyes. They understood the strength of that Red Cossack camp well, and that the number of cavalrymen guarding it had increased recently. Even if the battle was extremely short, they had expected Richard to be at least 2 hours slower. After all, he still needed to let his soldiers eat and rest before the attack. The fact that Richard returned this early proved how little time they took for both rest and the attack itself. It gave them a brand new understanding of his army, especially since he had returned with almost the same numbers that had gone out. Since when was Red Cossack so weak that they collapsed with a single blow? The question emerged within the minds of the two at the same time. However, these sly old foxes realized that such a thought would be mistaken. Red Cossacks might only grew and grew, never waning. This was an accomplishment of Richard's army alone. Did he have some other troops he did not expose earlier? That couldn't be. Supplying, garrisoning, and dispatching an army was a big affair that was impossible to hide perfectly. Moreover, how could their information networks miss an army hiding out near their own headquarters? Even if Richard held the numbers advantage, the slave camp was on defensible terrain. With 500 strong defenders and a troop of a few hundred horse bandits on top, it wasn't easy to wipe them out in a single attack. Both of them knew one thing in their hearts: the high-ranking generals they knew might not be able to get the job done with even 2,000 or 3,000 people, never mind the 1,000 men Richard had taken with him. Looking at Aman and Devon from afar, Richard stopped his horse and waved to them from a distance. After that, he pointed behind himself with a smile on his face. Devon patted his head repeatedly, turning to his subordinates and roaring, "Why aren't you lot preparing? Those are our slaves. Camps, guards, food, and doctors, is everything ready? Did I not make myself clear to you this morning? Why are you all still standing here like idiots? Since when had this fatty told them anything? Forget 8,000 slaves, he hadn't even brought up 80. A few of his subordinates had doubts in their hearts, but how could someone stupid be able to rise so high in the golden war flag? Every one of them just repeatedly said yes with a terrified face, rushing off to handle their tasks. Richard returned to the inn alongside his party. Naturally, there were some subordinates who could take care of the complicated matter of handing over the slaves. He believed this display would leave enough of an impression on the golden war flag and Marquis Anric. Red Cossack didn't just rely on their saints and ferocity to rule the roost. Their guards were widely known for great strength, their army comparable to that of a marquis. Powerhouses and elite soldiers were two sides of the coin of war, both were indispensable. One or two saints could not match up to an entire army, it would be like pitting a lion against a pack of wolves. However, an army without a powerhouse would falter under the attack of saints. The slightest gap in their defenses would allow the saints to decimate them with guerrilla tactics. Richard didn't want to put on a display of personal power, or of the power of his runes. He was showing off his ability at the helm of an army. He was the only one who could destroy Red Cossack's defenses without much of a military advantage. That way, both Anric and the Golden War Flag would go all out to support him. The army would not be an issue, either of them could give him enough soldiers and equipment. Richard had become the center of focus in the entire oasis. Hundreds of gazes were fixed upon him, a mix of envy and curiosity that did not lack hatred. Although nobody discussed it publicly, the rumors spread very quickly and soon everyone knew where those slaves had come from. The Red Cossack camp was the only place nearby with so many slaves, and the fact that they were his enemies was already a public secret. Riding his tall horse, Richard could overlook the majority of the people in the city. He had already become someone with a modicum of infamy. Workers were already beginning large-scale construction in his lands and refurbishing the existing buildings, with everything that used to belong to Skiddick now falling under his name. His territory in the Bloodstained lands was now large enough to build a large camp that could house 3,000 slaves. The new camp would be completed by the time Red Cossack was eliminated from Bluewater, just in time to consolidate his new status as one of its key influences. However, none of this was what he desired. All the power, all the reverence, the surging wealth, the ability to kill as he pleased, nothing mattered. He couldn't bring himself to be happy with these achievements. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 210. Desires, 2. That dark premonition was like a piece of lead in Richard's heart, urging him on to grow as powerful as he could as quickly as possible. He had to return to Norland. The power at his hand was indeed growing rapidly, but the further he walked this path the more distinctly he understood how strong Sharon and Mountainsea truly were. He had known before that Sharon was powerful, but had not possessed the ability to gauge the extent of her ability. It was like a mortal gazing up at the starry sky, knowing it was vast but not how much. He now felt like he had a slight idea, but that only made it clear to him that they were leagues apart with a vast ocean between them. As for Mountainsea, she walked a completely different path to power that he still couldn't see through. Back at the inn, the first thing he did was to enter the basement. The place had been turned into a temporary interrogation hall, the large room in the center connected to a dozen small cells. Numerous instruments of torture were placed in the middle, most of which had been borrowed from the Golden War flag. Most of the prisoners here were dwarves, with some leaders of the second-class Red Cossack caravan added on. A few sinister half-naked torturers were currently dragging a dwarf who was at his last breath off the rack. Standing at the side, Caesar quickly flipped through the holy tome in his hands. A gentle voice trembled out the chant for a healing spell, a ray of holy light pulling the near-dead dwarf back from death's door. The youth looked pale, evidently finding it difficult to handle the bloody scene. However, that difficulty did nothing to affect his spells. A shadow of the late Baron now lay across his face. His gift for the divine was apparent. It hadn't taken him long to get to level 3 where he could start casting healing spells. He would qualify to be a full cleric in any church on Phalar now. Ola was in charge of the entire procedure. His handsome, feminine features had been warped by fury, eyes shooting out a cold, cruel radiance. Hang him up and sober him with a few buckets of freezing water. Let's see if he can remember the route back to the Anvil of Lightning then. The elf shouted in exasperation. 2 torturers hung the dwarf up, pouring the water right on his face. The unconscious fellow yelled as he regained consciousness, all the wounds on his body throbbing with pain. He couldn't help but groan, but every grunt was laced with curses. The many rounds of torture had not broken him. There was practically no bit of skin on the dwarf's body that was still in good condition. Caesar was constantly casting lesser heals to preserve his life, but the cleric did not yet have the ability to fix the wounds. That was something only someone at Flosan's level could accomplish. Richard's eyes swept through the room the moment he entered, and his face immediately distorted into a frown. What? He asked Ola. They're still not willing to talk? These guys are like... No, they're the same as the dwarves back home, Ola smiled bitterly. Already cruel and merciless, the bard had learned a great many torture methods from Richard. On top of that, he had the help of a cleric. And yet, after an entire day and night, he still couldn't force these dwarves to give up the most important piece of information, the location of their tribe. One had to note that the presence of a cleric greatly enhanced the cruelty of torture. Of course, the extent of that depended on the level of the cleric. Even if one slipped up, a high priest could bring someone back from the brink of death. Richard's brows wrinkled even more. They're still insisting on what they said? Yes, master. Ola smiled bitterly, wiping away the sweat on his forehead. They've signed a contract with Red Cossack, witnessed by their god. They will support Red Cossack for 30 years, refusing to go against their oath. These dwarves are very stubborn, we need time to wear them down. Richard looked over the prisoners, asking, "Did you tell them clearly what that means?" His tone was extremely cold, to the point that even Ola couldn't help but tremble. "I've already warned them that allying with Red Cossack will make them our enemy, and that we're never lenient to our foes. They know cooperating is their only chance of survival, but the dwarves of the Anvil will never betray an oath to our god." A coarse roar sounded out, interrupting the elf's words. It was a rough gunman, his mustache so coarse it looked like a horse's mane. Richard headed to the dwarf's cage and crouched down, speaking calmly, "I don't need you to betray your god. Just give me the formula for your gunpowder, and I'll let you go. If you still want to support Red Cossack after that, do as you wish. However, let me remind you, Red Cossack is a target I must exterminate. I won't hold back if I see your kind at their side." "You want the formula for the Thunder God's fire? Dream on." The gunman guffawed, spitting at Richard. Richard's expression grew cold. Air surged as his magic barrier stirred, sending the saliva flying back to paste itself on the dwarf's face. He did not have the patience to waste time on the dwarf, instead walking up to the caravan captains. "What about you? Are any of you going to tell me what I want to know?" Most of them were silent, only one middle-aged man spitting in contempt as he said fiercely, "You dare steal Red Cossack's goods and kill our people? Wait for your death. Once our army arrives, you should pray you die in battle. If you don't, burly men of all races will be waiting for your ass. Your women won't do any better. They'll be taken by at least 50 every day." Richard stood up, a silencing spell cutting off the man's words. "Why is it that everyone we meet is smelly and stubborn?" He frowned. "Isn't there anyone in Red Cossack afraid of death?" His voice was calm, but Ola shivered once more. He had no idea how to answer, but he could not remain quiet either. The atmosphere was stifling in the silence. "Master, we might just have had bad luck this time," he said carefully. "If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 211. Desires, 3. The dwarves had actually played along in the beginning, talking about their battles with Red Cossack. However, when it came to matters of principle like their gunpowder recipes or the location of their tribe, they turned into rocks that would not open their mouths. Ola tried every method he knew over the entire day, but there was no progress. This was something he had never encountered before. Even Norland's dwarves weren't this unyielding. Any decently sized group, regardless of race, was bound to have some people who were timid and greedy. However, every prisoner they had taken from the caravan was extremely stubborn. It could only be chalked up to bad luck. "I don't have the time," Richard coldly interrupted, pointing at the middle-aged Red Cossack captain. "Drag him out." A few men opened the door of the cage, pulling the man out and placing him in front of Richard. The mage did not speak a word, merely closing his eyes as his breathing grew more ragged and his face ashen. It only lasted a short while, though his breaths were back to normal by the time he opened his eyes again. However, in the depths of those pupils was something nobody here could see clearly. Richard's gaze bored into the middle-aged man's eyes. "I've run out of patience. Tell me right now, where is the Anvil of Lightning?" The middle-aged man groaned, not answering the question. However, Richard did not frown this time, only taking the sword from Ola's waist. Schlick, the blade cut off the man's right hand. Blood spurted out like a fountain, turning the fellow's face white. He let out a stifled groan, but still remained unyielding as he tried to stay upright without shouting. Richard looked him in the eyes, saying solemnly, "I do not have any more time. The more you delay me, the lower the chances that these other two survive. And they're very important to me." "Then let them die," came the response. Schlick, the left arm fell to the floor. "Where is the anvil of lightning?" Richard asked twice more, the lack of response robbing the man of both his legs. "Caesar," Richard called. The youth could not keep his hands from trembling, but still managed to complete a lesser healing spell. This would only slow down the bleeding, causing the man to die a slower death. A simple healing spell could not fix such deep wounds. Richard passed the sword back to Ola. The bard noticed that the fingers gripping the blade had turned pale, an indication that the mage had overexerted his energy. The mage wasn't actually feeling as calm as he looked. His heart was boiling with a volcanic rage that could erupt at any time. Richard took out a handkerchief, wiping his hands that were stained with blood as he spoke to Ola, "You can go and rest now. Come back tomorrow morning. If they are still unwilling to yield, cut all their limbs off in the evening and throw them outside the city." "Yes, master," Ola replied with his head lowered. For some reason, even though some past orders had been crueler, this one felt especially bone-chilling. It was as if his master had completely transformed into someone else over the past few days. Only after Richard left the interrogation room could the bard manage to relax. He let out a deep breath, thick beads of sweat pouring down his face to drench his entire outfit. Feeling uncomfortable, the elf cast an angry gaze at the captives and hurled expletives their way, having the guards keep a close eye on them as he left the interrogation room. That night he felt especially depressed, as though something was stuck in his chest. He needed to find a place to have a drink and relax. When he returned to his room, Richard closed the door and forced himself to calm down as he tried to start meditating. The Archaran blood in the depths of his body was roaring without end, giving him a strong urge to rip apart everything in his way. He sat down and tried to quiet the restless blood, his consciousness slowly becoming still. His inner mind was initially black everywhere, but a starry blue light slowly lit up in a corner. A specter of himself revolved around that blue sea, a translucent silhouette of his own body that was covered in faint mist. The dull lights were a representation of his current magical abilities. Given his blessing of wisdom, it did not take any time to accurately calculate the depth of his mana pool. As a level 11 mage, he currently had a total of 800 points of mana. He wasn't far from level 12. The color of the magic lights represented the distribution of the different elements. His own mana pool was a mix of different colors, a balanced chaos with no specific affinity. This was the most common type of mana. Numerous dark red lines roamed all over his body, each as slender as a spiderweb. If he concentrated on them and magnified the image, he could see that these traces resembled blood vessels. However, the blood flowing within them was close to boiling temperature. This was not the first time he had come across this scene during meditation. He knew that they were not his real veins, merely a vestige of his Archaran bloodline strength. The Archaran bloodline was unbelievably powerful. Even a mere grade 2 ability like Blaze was extremely strong. It could speed up his spellcasting by over 20%, only limited by the fact that his immature bloodline would not allow him to use Eruption at the same time. Using Blaze was equivalent to forfeiting his own survival skills. In the deepest part of his body was a large, fuzzy tree, with lush branches that spread out everywhere. They reached the extremes of his body, intertwining with that crimson web. One could not trace the branches back to the root, nor could they find the end. A vast array of roots encircled 5 trunks, with most of the branches and leaves growing out of one. This tree was a manifestation of his elven blood, the 5 trunks representing the affinities granted by his bloodline: nature, the elements, recovery, illusion, and moonforce. The most developed of the lot was the trunk of nature, the origin of the boost to his nature's beckon spell. The moonforce trunk had grown a little as well, but the other 3 were mostly stems without much growth. A cloud of mana pervaded the tree and the spiderwebs, constantly pumping into both bloodlines and spilling out once more. However, the mana was being worn down a little in this process. The effect was so minute that Richard only sensed it because of his sharpness and care. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 212. To return home. Bloodline abilities had been studied extensively in Norland. They did not pop out of thin air, instead drawing power based on the wielder's class. For a warrior that was energy and for mage mana, but there were other options like astral power, fire, and moon force. This absorbed power was then mutated into the ability, be it powerful or useless. That was why only a lucky few had the gift to be born with them. Most people unlocked abilities as they grew in level. Those like Richard, possessing multiple bloodlines that could grant abilities, were often met with the quandary of choice. The more they used one of their bloodlines, the more it would develop. With time, it would grow to dominate the rest. Richard allowed his mind to still once more, his soul force gradually spreading out. The mana within his body started to radiate outside, seemingly sensing something. With the mana rippling out from his silent sea of consciousness, it revealed the occasional ray of blue astral light nearby. These rays were trapped by the mana, pulled into his body to slightly strengthen him. This light immediately dissolved once it entered his body, but it turned a small portion of his mana blue. This was the beginning portion of Sharon's unique meditation technique, the deep blue fantasy. This method allowed one to sense rays of astral light that held unknown properties, not using elemental mana. This blue energy was somewhat similar to astral power, but it wasn't exactly the same. Outside of the ability to substitute for all other kinds of mana, Richard hadn't been able to find any of its unique strengths yet. Richard had only begun to use the deep blue fantasy after he advanced to level 10. Every ray he caught was equivalent to 1/10 of a point of mana. He could normally capture anywhere from 1 to 3 rays for every hour of meditation, making the technique thrice as fast as any ordinary methods. These details were proof of how rich the Deep Blue's inheritance was. Meditation was not easy. Richard found it difficult to enter the depths of his mind, which was why he only managed to find a single astral ray within the hour. On top of that, his Archaran bloodline suddenly grew boisterous the moment it entered him, absorbing the power quickly. This was the first time his bloodline was absorbing power of its own accord. All of a sudden it flashed an image in his mind, one that was extremely familiar to him, a fragment of the future scenes he had witnessed due to the divine grace. It was an image of Sharon, her body floating in the boundless void. Richard abruptly opened his eyes, spitting out a mouthful of blood. The crimson liquid did not even make it to the floor, vaporizing the moment it spurted out. Bang! The door to his room was suddenly pushed open. Flozen had darted in from next door, barely in time to see the wisp of bloody mist. She couldn't help but cry out, "What's wrong?" Some shuffling sounds rang out, and Waterflower and Phaser charged in as well, in that order. They were both closely connected to Richard's soul, and immediately sensed him wavering. This distress was like a haze that stretched out to push them down, as if about to devour the entire world in a moment. Richard swayed, suddenly feeling fatigued and weak. He couldn't help but lean into Flosan's embrace, looking pale as he closed his eyes and said gently, I'm fine. I just want to go home." Seeing the blood still flowing from the corner of his mouth, Flosan hugged him tightly. We'll go back very soon. What's wrong with you? Don't scare me." She tried to wipe the blood off his face, but her ice-cold hands were shaking. She only managed to smear the bloodstains further. The blood Richard had coughed out reeked with the aura of magic, feeling very similar to the greatest catastrophe a mage could ever be plagued by: mana disintegration. Flosan's mind had blanked the moment she came through the door to see the evaporating mist. She was no longer the divine cleric who was calm as water, instead holding the young man tightly in her arms as she felt just as helpless as any other. Although their souls were not connected, she could still sense the haze of despair appearing in the depths of his soul, practically covering the last light of his consciousness. It felt like the heavens themselves were collapsing, leaving her without the strength to reach out and resist. Stood at the side, Waterflower just held the Shepherd of Eternal Rest tightly while at a loss. She only knew to kill, not to heal. While those delicate fingers of hers were pale with the exertion already, she knew that her blade could do nothing in this situation. It was instead Phaser, standing silently in the corner so far, that said something stiffly. This was still Divine Tongue, but it was the same language used in Norland so Flozin could understand. Divine Spell. Restoration. Flozin suddenly returned to herself, only then remembering that she was a cleric. She helped Richard up and quickly started a chant, preparing the healing spell. It would not fix the mana disintegration, but at least it would treat the wounds. However, even this spell that she could recite in her dreams she failed twice, only managing to cast it properly on the third attempt. The rejuvenating power immediately seeped into every part of Richard's body, returning a rosy tint to his pale face. The violent movements of his Archaran bloodline finally abated, the berserking mana quieting down. Richard closed his eyes, recovering for a moment before he opened them again. "I'm fine. There were just some small issues during the meditation. There's no need to worry." Flozin opened her mouth, but eventually decided not to continue the topic. "All right. But don't meditate any more tonight. The spell needs time to work." Richard nodded, smiling as he always did. "Fine, no problem. You lot should get back to sleep now." His elegant elven face had been sharpened and restrained by numerous trips to death's door. It was indeed late. Just like they had arrived, Waterflower and Phaser turned into two shadows that silently left the room. When Flozin was at the door, she suddenly turned back and said earnestly, "We will return quickly." Richard maintained that striking smile as he shook his head. "There's no rush. We shouldn't hurry the matter, just keep working on our own schedule." The cleric nodded hard before returning to her room, giving him some space. Richard lay down on the bed, but just couldn't fall asleep. The restoration spell was showing its effects. The divine power had activated his body's healing abilities, healing the injuries very quickly. By the time the divine force was completely exhausted, a biting fatigue ate into every sinew of his body that left him craving rest. However, the moment he closed his eyes, those premonitions that shook him to the very core appeared in his sight once more. They were impossible to get rid of. Since he couldn't sleep, he got dressed and made his way out of bed, taking out his tools as he began to craft runes. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 213. Trolls Battle. Richard found no problem with crafting an elementary strength rune, even with his mana depleted. The only adverse effect was that the boost would be slightly lower than normal. The rune he was currently working on was meant for medium rare, and would raise the troll's might greatly. Runes weren't limited to humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, any race with adequate intelligence could use them with only minor adjustments. Even some powerful magic beasts could use runes, an example being the mounts of rune knights. However, few people in history had crafted runes for trolls and barbarians, even for elementary runes. Most runemasters in history had come from humans and elves, and with the elven empires split apart, most current runemasters were human. Every single one was a person of high esteem, and regardless of the quality of their runes, demand always outstripped supply. Who would create runes for barbarians and trolls, beings that humans believed were only a step above beasts? Trolls could indeed equip runes. They were different from orcs in that regard, many even having talent for magic. Tiramisu himself was a prime example of this. Although the rune Richard was crafting wasn't customized for trolls, given his strong vitality, medium rare would only feel slightly uncomfortable when using it. However, his strength would still be boosted to a great extent. Costs would skyrocket if he wanted to make the custom rune, and it would take 3 months to craft. On top of that, outside of the comfort when using it, the bonus to the strength boost would be a measly 5%. The elementary strength rune was nearly complete by dawn. It would only take 2 more days to finish. A calm day passed in Bluewater. People had many things to discuss, mostly with regards to Richard returning with nearly 8,000 slaves. Although he had kept all the sturdy barbarians and wild elves to himself, the remaining desert warriors were still worth 50,000 gold. And this was only the price in the bloodstained lands. 50,000 gold was no small amount to anyone, so everyone was naturally happy to chat about it throughout the day. However, once night fell, the people had one more thing to discuss. That was the sudden appearance of a dozen people at the boundaries of the city. It was a mixed group of humans and dwarves. The attention-grabbing detail was that all of them had their limbs amputated, but were still healed by divine spells. The stumps were not bleeding profusely, and at the very least they would not die in the next few days. They tossed about, their wails of anguish so agonizing that even the hardened residents of the bloodstained lands were appalled. Some had recognized that the humans hailed from Red Cossack, but nobody dared relieve them of their pain. They did not even have the courage to end their suffering. People had already noticed that Richard's subordinates were the ones who had dumped these fellows here. Now, this handsome young mage was no different from a demon in their eyes. The same night Richard had plundered the second-class caravan and reached Bluewater with its goods, the Red Cossack agents in the city had silently left to avoid his blade. However, nobody would believe that the ferocious merchant group had conceded to the great mage. The local agent just felt like he did not have the strength to engage Richard in combat, so he retreated for now. Red Cossack had started out as a bandit group, and they were scattered across the vast land. They rarely placed massive military forces in a single city. Their response to this provocation would definitely be fierce. The conflict between Richard and Red Cossack had reached the point of no return. Given how he had dealt with the entire situation, it was obvious that he had no more mercy than them. Blood did not scare these people, but it definitely stopped anyone who harbored ill intent for him because of his age. The onlookers naturally had their own opinions of the situation, but they consciously lowered their voice. This was a display of Richard's power. Night fell once more. Richard was finishing up on his strength rune, while Flozen was in the middle of her nightly classes for her apprentices where she taught them how to amass divine power and use it. Waterflower was still hidden in the darkness. Nobody outside of Richard could pinpoint her location. Phaser occasionally hovered nearby, but sometimes she just wandered around in the city. Gangder and Tiramisu stayed with the army, with 100 new barbarians and 60 elven archers. Training had to be stepped up so they could integrate into the forces as soon as possible. The others had their own matters to attend to. Richard would be staying in Bluewater for some more time. News had already arrived from Kelleck's side. He had finished absorbing all the divine power, and he was bringing his own army over. 300 warriors of the demon hunting spears had accepted Richard's recruitment and would hasten over once their current missions came to an end. While they would take a collective 3,000 coins per month, elites that were level 7 at minimum with 2 powerful level 13 swordsmen meant he was getting his money's worth. All that was left was to wait for the Saint of the Golden War Flag, Fulcao. When he arrived, there would be no need to fear any sudden attack by Red Cossack. The rune meant for Rolf was already in production. It cost a great deal to make and would last half an hour per activation. Whenever active, it would enhance the user's strength by 20% and defense by 10%, the combination of two effects signifying its status as a grade 2 rune. Most of the magic arrays would be shaved off after 2 uses, however, leaving behind very little power. This was the most important part and the reason for the high cost. A self-destructing magic array that had a limit on the number of uses was difficult to draw. A normal grade 2 rune would only cost 2/3 as much. In a tavern at the side of the city, Medium Rare, Ola, and Phaser were drinking at a table. They were mostly here because of the troll's existence. Medium Rare was unwelcome in most taverns because he would scare off the other customers. Perhaps it was due to his sole contract with Richard, but Ola had been jittery as of late. He'd thus pulled medium rare away for a few drinks, and for some reason, Phaser had come along as well. However, the elf had no other thoughts for the night, eager to rinse his throat with alcohol and wash away the restlessness of his troll. Phaser was wrapped up in a dark robe, hiding the unique features that would attract attention. Business was slow in the tavern anyway, with only 2 tables filled, but bottles were already strewn over theirs. Medium rare alone had the capacity of 7 or 8 sturdy men, his large body not even fitting into the chair. He had to sit on the floor, bringing him to the same height as the seated Ola. The elven bard himself was used to high society where alcohol tolerance was an essential weapon, while Phaser wasn't half bad either. The alcohol seemed to have no effect on her. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 214 Trolls Battle 2. The tavern boss walked out, 6 bottles of homemade whiskey in his hand. He almost couldn't keep up with the pace of the trolls drinking. This batch is from my personal collection. It has a different taste, but be careful. The thing's strong, he politely reminded them. However, his tone made it seem like he was actually egging them on. It was obvious that these customers could drink up all his stock, earning him a great deal of money. Medium rare hummed an affirmative, grabbing the tray and placing it on the table. He took one of the bottles by the neck, pouring the liquid down his throat. A wood-tinted smell of fruit spread out as the alcohol flowed out, and the mellow taste was much better than anything they'd gotten before. This rich fluid was actually very strong. By the time the bottle's contents were in his stomach, even the troll felt a comforting dizziness. The door to the tavern was pulled open, and 2 groups of people entered one after the other. Looking at their attire, they were bounty hunters, a common profession in the bloodstained lands. These sorts of people did anything to earn the money for drink, be it working as bodyguards or bandits. The first group of 4 managed to find a good place, leaving the 3 behind discontent. There were only 2 tables left in the tavern, and both were next to medium rare. Nobody dared get close to the troll, as good-natured as he seemed. The 3 bounty hunters muttered something, but it was already far too late and they seemingly didn't want to find another place. They chose a table and sat down. One of them was a little clumsy while taking his seat, sending his coat flying to brush against the back of medium rare's head. "Hey! You touched me!" Medium rare stated roughly. "Sorry, friend. This place is a little narrow," the hunter answered apologetically, fear in his voice. His companions looked over nervously as well, nobody daring to do something that could cause a misunderstanding. Thankfully, medium rare was in no mood to bicker. The matter was concluded with a wave of his hand, and Ola just glanced at the hunters without bothering about them. The troll was starting to get tipsy, putting him in a good mood. The continuous battles had left every bit of his body filled with strength. It wouldn't be long before he could break through to level 13. His body had grown more nimble as well, a sign of an upcoming mutation. Although he hadn't mutated at level 12, it wouldn't be bad to do so at level 13. After all, only 1 or 2 out of every 10 trolls could mutate in the first place. However, he felt a slight numbness in the back of his head, as if a mosquito had stung him. He scratched at the place, cursing the savage creature. The bloodstained lands truly were strange. There were mosquitoes here capable of piercing a troll's thick skin. The hunters at the 2 tables sat down, ordering alcohol and dishes as they began to brag noisily. They mentioned their escapades and adventures, the occasional chuckles making the place more lively. Medium rare and Ola were chatting happily as well. "You don't know this, but old Nasir made me and tiramisu eat some sludge that was roots, grass, and leaves mixed together every day. It was just nasty. But old Nasir said I'd slowly get smarter if I ate it every day." What's the point of being smart? Strength is always better for strong enemies. Tiramisu's smarter than me, he never beat me before even with magic. Right, little Ola, did you know old Nasir told me I could learn magic too? Ugh, but I hate staying in a single pose like a fool. Oh, of course master is an exception. I just prefer going directly, using my hammer to smash the enemy's heads. Ola snorted in response, didn't you and your brother like cooking then? When did you get the chance to crush skulls? Also, I'm older than you. Stop calling me little Ola. Medium Rare scratched his head and wondered in confusion, I liked cooking then? Did I say that? I could. Old Nasir's food was horrible. And then he died. Although his food was terrible, me and Tiramisu really liked him. We also like humans. The humans that turned you into a slave. Ola stated coldly. He had once been a slave to humans' wills. His mixed blood ensured he would never have status amongst both humans and elves. Medium Rare scratched his head, but master is human. Ola nodded this time, showing his approval. Richard was actually a fairly good master, treating his subordinates very well. His future was also promising. He'd be even better if those two fierce women weren't by his side. Flozan and Waterflower were exceptionally beautiful, but he rued the very thought of them now. In fact, he didn't think he could even get it up for them. At that moment, Medium Rare felt the back of his head itching once more. The mosquito's venom seemed to be quite potent. Trolls had nature resistance to toxins and illness, and a mosquito able to hurt him was something he had never seen before. He reached over to scratch, but then he suddenly shouted. There was a huge, swollen sore on the back of his head the size of a bowl. It was fine before he scratched it, but it burst apart the moment he scratched it and sprayed black blood everywhere. The pain was bone-piercing. What's going on? Ola was terrified and stunned, immediately sobering up. He quickly stood up, only to see that the 7 bounty hunters that had come in late were drawing weapons from their robes. A few crossbows were already aimed at him, but the hunter closest to the troll had already drawn a dull, large dagger at some point in time, aiming it to pierce the troll's back. The attack was fast and fierce, unexpectedly quiet. If not for Ola coincidentally looking that way and seeing it, he wouldn't even have noticed someone was there. An assassin. A powerful assassin. Ola's hair practically stood on end, the chill of death already pervading his heart. The 4 crossbows fired simultaneously, the short, tailless bolts whistling through the air. 3 of them shone with a mysterious blue light, evidently laced with powerful toxins. Given how close they were, Ola couldn't dodge at all. Given his physique, even with chainmail on he could not block the massive arrows coming his way, but Medium Rare roared furiously, the bellowing noise causing everyone to see black. All the bottles of wine in the tavern exploded, fragments flying everywhere. He didn't seem to be affected by the dagger piercing his ribs, agilely getting up and placing his broad body as a barrier that protected Ola and Phaser. Dull sounds rang out as the 4 poisoned bolts entered the troll's back, embedded deep into his body. They only left 4 small holes on the surface of his back. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 215. Trolls Battle, 3. Go! Medium Rare grabbed a table and threw it behind him. His tremendous strength turned even the blunt edge of the table top into a terrifying blade. The faces of the hunters changed. They jumped out of the way one by one, not one having the courage to receive the blow. They knew all too well how terrifying the power of an enraged troll could get. The assassin stuck close to Medium Rare, his actions practiced and skillful. Using the whirling table as a blind spot, his dagger left a frightful wound on the troll's enormous body. The muscles around the injury squirmed nonstop, as if trying to close the wound. However, it was to no avail. A stream of blood poured out, as if a wine barrel had been smashed open against a counter. Even the troll's powerful vitality could not stem the blood flow. The dagger clearly was enchanted to enhance its cutting power. Medium Rare turned around, howling as he threw a punch at the assassin. The nimble killer seemed to turn into a shadow as he avoided the heavy blow, once again plunging his blade into the back of the troll's knee. It left behind a wound that was at least 10 centimeters deep. The troll roared in pain. The tendons in his right leg had been broken, leaving him unable to support his body as he landed heavily on his knee. The brief exchange proved that the assassin was at least level 14, and even the others disguised as bounty hunters were level 11 or above. Ola's face paled. For a split second, he entertained the thought of escaping alone. This was clearly a planned assassination. Given his ability, if he stayed he would undoubtedly die. However, that hesitation was fleeting. He clenched his teeth, quickly starting his spellsong. Sadly, there were few spells he could use in this situation, and they were all weak. Neither his skills at archery nor his warsongs were useful in an indoor melee. Facing many high-level opponents, he knew that these grade 3 spells couldn't do much. Still, this was the only way he could help medium rare. Phaser stood up, but she remained in a strange curled posture as she tried her best to reduce her size as a target. Her gaze was fixed on the tavern boss. He looked like any other old man to the ordinary eye, his expression one of panic, but in her vision he was lighting a flame as he prepared for battle. His internal energy was murky and thick, putting him at level 13 at minimum. Careful of the boss, she shrieked urgently. Her sharp voice pierced everyone's ears like a needle, stopping them in their tracks. Originally driven insane by the alcohol and acute pain, medium rare immediately sobered up. A dark silhouette flashed behind Phaser only moments after her shout, a jagged armor-breaking sword entering her back. Even her natural armor could not hold out against the sharp blade, an ear-splitting crack ringing out as the weapon pierced straight towards her heart. Medium rare started howling once more, his skin quickly turning red. This was a sign of him going berserk. The troll swung horizontally, sweeping his fist towards the tavern boss who was making his way towards him. The boss paled in shock, the air blown towards him was bitingly cold, holding overwhelming might. There wasn't enough distance to dodge, he could only erect a barrier of energy as a last-second measure before crossing his arms, doggedly trying to fend off this attack. Cracking sounds rang out as the man's bones were shattered. He was flung away by the punch, sent flying through 2 walls before crashing outside the tavern. Even though he had level 14 energy, he was only an assassin, he was bound to be injured in a direct confrontation against someone with extraordinary strength. With that done, medium rare slammed into the wall. The wood collapsed like cardboard, the broken piece fished out by the troll and thrown towards the crowd of assassins. A fierce whistle rang out as the wall smashed towards their head, powder flying everywhere. Even the level 15 assassin didn't dare try and block it. One of them was a little too slow to dodge the attack. The edge of the broken wall knocked into him, sending him flying into the distance. On the other hand, their leader had fallen to the ground in a flash. Moving like a lizard, he made it to medium rare's feet in the blink of an eye. Using a dagger that was as wide as an axe, he sliced into the troll's foot and cut off 2 of his toes. Arg! Medium rare howled in pain, punching the floor with his huge fist. The blow smashed a deep pit into the floor, the explosive wind coming from the outburst blowing away some of the customers who could not get away in time. The snake-like assassin was long gone, even having left another wound on the troll's elbow. This cut was too hurried to make it to the bone, but the diagonal slash exposed red and white tissue to leave blood splattering everywhere. On the other side, Phaser's body trembled as she swept her left arm behind her. However, the assassin only smiled sadistically as the dagger in his hand pulled out and stabbed her twice more. His level was so much higher than hers that her actions were extremely slow in his eyes. There were numerous flaws in her defense, and even after the 2 extra stabs he could calmly stretch out his left hand to grip her attacking hand's wrist. This exchange was enough for him to learn of her strength. His hand was like a steel vise, and he had full confidence that it would shatter her wrist. And indeed, her left hand fell into his, but he didn't feel like he had grabbed her wrist at all. He could feel a blade's edge within, and given how much force he had exerted, that one grip stung his palm hard enough to reach the bone. The assassin felt enraged at losing to this hidden weapon, immediately drawing his sword to stab Phaser's heart again. However, a strong wind blew in his face as a huge fist entered his sight. He hadn't thought that the troll, injured as he was by his comrades, would choose him as the target. Only able to use his arms to block, he was sent flying by medium rare. Go! Quickly! The troll scooped Phaser up, tossing her out through the hole in the wall. He then reached out and grabbed Ola, throwing the bard away as well. His actions were violent and sudden, interrupting Ola's spellcasting. You're more important to master. Go quickly. I'll stop them. Medium Rare yelled, using his huge body to plug the hole in the tavern's wall. The face of the assassin leader fell. He waved his dagger and charged forth like a shadow in the wind, every flash leaving deep wounds in the troll's head. Rare's heavy fists did not hit him at all. The troll was covered in wounds that severely slowed him down, only relying on instinct to throw punches just to buy time. How could such random attacks hit a level 15 assassin? However, the leader's expression only turned colder. His dagger flashed faster and faster, basically splitting Medium Rare apart until there was no more blood to spill, but the troll remained standing as he threw punches that were each stronger than the last. A momentary slip-up could spell lethal danger. Trolls were indeed tenacious, but this was unheard of. The most wretched thing was that the thing had sent away its weaker companions. Was this not just cruel stupidity? Outside the pub, Ola and Phaser had fallen to the ground. The bard turned over and got up. There were no thoughts in his mind outside of saving Medium Rare. His vision red, he stared at the tavern and started dashing towards the troll, who looked like he was made of blood. However, his feet were suddenly pulled back and he fell again. Escape. Phaser only said this one word, her tone inhuman. She then paid no more attention to him, jumping up from her spot and rushing off into the dark night. She shrugged off her robe, exposing her body completely as she melded into the darkness in a few steps. Being sent to the cold ground calmed Ola down. He finally understood clearly that rushing back would not save Rare's life, it would only add to their own casualties. Medium Rare was originally the most likely one to escape. An enraged level 12 troll was someone perhaps only a saint could stop without getting hurt. However, he still chose to let the weaker Ola and Phaser escape. In his simple mind, he only knew that they were more important to Richard. He raised his head to look in their direction one last time. The troll's large body was like a firm mountain, blocking the hole in the wall. Blood, flesh, even his organs constantly spilled out from his sides, but his humongous body stayed still to the end. Ola turned around and flew out, not daring to look back even if the pain in his chest screamed for him to take it out on someone. He was scared of attracting the attention of the assassins. They had already managed to get to the small window in the kitchen and jumped out to attack. His steps felt far heavier than usual. He knew that he now carried the weight of the troll's original responsibilities on his shoulders. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 216. No need for anger. Back at the inn, Richard had just finished the last stroke of his rune. He suddenly raised his head, looking out the window. Only a moment ago, he had felt an intense throb in the bottom of his heart. A strong warning was blaring out from Medium Rare. Something happened? The slave contract only allowed him to know his slave's approximate location. If they were too far apart, his party could only send vague emotions over. He had an intense feeling of danger, but couldn't tell what exactly had happened to Medium Rare. On top of that, he had only sensed a fighting will as well as a warning. There was no sign of any request for help. He immediately sealed the rune he had just crafted, changing into robes that were equipped with a defensive spell formation. He then took out a sealed box, removing an assortment of scrolls and placing them in the pocket. A loud shout woke Flozen up, getting her to prepare for battle as quickly as possible. He also stirred everyone connected to his soul, ordering them to get ready for a fight. He was now certain that something had gone wrong. More fuzzy warnings were coming from Ola and Phaser. However, the two were too weak. Given the distance, the information transmitted was a lot fainter than what came from Rare. Richard went about his preparations like this was any other war, finishing up within a single minute. He then made his way downstairs to the inn's ground floor. The entire inn was bustling. Richard's personal guard had rushed out from their rooms, throwers flooding out from the basement. Humongous bats flew out of the attic, hovering high in the night sky. They used their powerful hearing and the sharp vision that came from being the Broodmother's drones, scouring the entire city for any suspicious activity. In the army camp nearby, Tiramisu abruptly woke up from his dreams. His head was splitting with pain, and he howled as he cradled it in his arms. Thunderous roars rang out as Gangder drove the sleeping soldiers out of their tents, grabbing their weapons and armor before gathering at the plaza to await orders. Hundreds of desert warriors rushed into the stables. The leaders and elites were all veterans who had followed Richard through more than a dozen major battles, making them both loyal and powerful. These valiant soldiers only needed a falchion and a horse to become elite cavalrymen. The cavalry had gathered up by the 3-minute mark. Gangder led them in a charge towards the inn. The infantry would be taken care of by the 2 novice knights. Within a few minutes, Richard's troops had been mobilized. The elites were already in formation, able to enter battle at any time. However, this information did not overwhelm him. His gift of wisdom was being used to the fullest. Although the information coming from the trio of Ola, Medium Rare, and Phaser was growing more ominous as time went by, he still maintained absolute calm. This was a part of his fundamentals as a mage of the deep blue. Just as he walked past a row of windows in the corridor leading downstairs, Richard suddenly grew alert. He dropped to the ground without thinking, instantly casting a range barrier. A light buzz sounded out, the magical shield flickering out of existence. It had been shattered practically the moment it appeared, a long silver arrow soundlessly flitting through Richard's original position. The arrow then plunged into the darkness, flying off towards the unknown. Richard leapt up. This was another brush with death, but he was no longer afraid. In fact, there were no fluctuations in his emotions as he stood in front of the window, looking outside. It was already late into the night, everything shrouded in pitch-black darkness. Richard couldn't see the archer with his naked eye, only knowing that someone in the depths of the darkness was definitely watching him. He merely stood in front of the window, natural and calm as he looked at the unknown opponent. There was no provocation or wrath, instead an inexplicable calmness that made it seem like nothing had happened just then. Standing in front of the window made Richard a good target once more. However, there was no second arrow shooting towards him. He certainly wouldn't continue to wait, merely standing in front of the window for a while before turning to head downstairs. He then took command of his personal guard and the throwers. A slender figure was stood atop a wooden building a few hundred meters away. A longbow that was even larger than his body was put down, before he shook his head and turned to fly to the outskirts of the city. Richard finally felt an intense fluctuation in his consciousness, coming from the node that belonged to Ola. It was clear that the elf was much closer now, but he didn't rush towards the inn. As a bard, he quickly made his way to the barracks so he could join the troops. His abilities could only be used to their fullest when amidst an army. On the other hand, Phaser had crossed half the city at an extraordinary speed to return to his side. She was injured as well, but the damage was not fatal. The assassin had assumed she was human and attacked accordingly, but her internal structure was completely different. This was another of the Broodmother's deceptions. Stood at the inn's plaza, Richard watched the strong barbarians and throwers gather together. The troops were almost ready in the time it had taken him to walk here from his room. However, just as he was about to issue orders, Richard's face suddenly fell. The node belonging to Medium Rare had dimmed completely, disappearing to his mind's eye. Still, He only stopped for a moment before he mounted his horse. He then led his troops on a charge towards the tavern the troll had been attacked in. Everyone who hadn't slept yet was left stunned, none having the guts to stand in their way. At that moment, a majestic aura rose up from a corner of the city. "Who dares wreak havoc in Bluewater?" A dignified voice resounded throughout the city. This was the aura of a powerhouse. The sword Saint Rolf had already risen into the sky, energy swirling around his longsword to emit a bright radiance that was extremely striking in the night. All of the starlight in the sky seemed dim in comparison. However, more than 10 black shadows had already left the city by this time, quickly escaping into the depths of the bloodstained lands. A few of them were the assassins who had disguised themselves as bounty hunters in the tavern, the level 15 assassin among them as well. One of them suddenly raised his head, speaking to the level 15 assassin, "Sir, something's wrong. That bat in the sky has been following us ever since we left the city." "Don't bother. Someone will take care of it," the assassin replied calmly. A long arrow flew out from nowhere, nailing the bat's body like a lightning bolt. The creature struggled for a little while after the arrow penetrated its body, but it wasn't long before it suddenly burst into a cloud of bloody mist. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 217. Brothers. Far away, Richard suddenly squinted. Tears streamed out from his eyes as though they were stung by smoke, but a quick wipe from his handkerchief took care of that. The Broodmother's elites used their own power to sustain their connection with him, so even if they were eliminated it would only cause a little irritation at most. However, this was the first time one of his elite bats had been exterminated. It reminded Richard of the archer that had ambushed him at the inn. That fellow's archery was extremely impressive, far surpassing Ola. His range had to be over 800 meters, making him a nemesis of mages. However, most long-range enchanted arrows used the power of nature to track their targets. His elven bloodline ensured he was extremely sensitive to them. A plot for a serial assassination had been put into action that night. The actual killing began with a remote strike ambushing his subordinates, and when he received this news he was expected to look his calm. Hurrying into the open, he would then be killed himself. However, his calm vigilance and quick mobilization of the troops had been unexpectedly immaculate. In addition to that, Richard himself had an extraordinary perception that allowed him to sense the threat and avoid the fatal blow. Rolf was neither too early nor too late. However, Richard knew that it would be far too difficult for him to catch up to the assassins. And even if he did manage to chase up to them, even a saint would have no choice but to flee in the face of a level 15 assassin, level 14 archer, and more than 10 level 11 killers. If the opponents deployed themselves properly, even escape would be impossible. The difference between level 15 and level 16 wasn't too apparent. It was level 18 where most mages and other powerhouses received new, powerful skills. Richard had already memorized their general characteristics. Although they were experts at disguise, there were numerous secret spells in the deep blue that were beyond their comprehension. Once he was of a higher level, there would surely be a way to catch them. A moment later, Richard was already standing at the small tavern where the bloody battle had taken place. All of his followers were staring at the gory battlefield in silence. Medium Rare was collapsed on the ground, still in the midst of an attack. His enormous body was riddled with countless injuries, all his organs bled out. The troll's left forearm was only left with a tiny patch of skin, all on the upper side. 2 other corpses were left behind in the tavern, the chest of one completely caved in. Judging by his posture, the troll had likely rammed his head into the man's body and sent him flying. The ruptured ribs had pierced through his heart and lungs, making the injury fatal. The troll was collapsed in the opening in the wall. The assassins would have had to walk over his corpse to walk through. Richard stood unmoving before the dead body. Heavy footsteps sounded behind him, as Rolf's deep and mellow voice rang out, "A subordinate of yours?" "A follower," Richard corrected. The difference between the two words was minute, but it was extremely important to Richard. Subordinates were often temporary, but followers would be companions for a long time. They were like brothers and comrades in arms. Rolf shrugged in response, merely a troll. But he really was formidable, what a pity. His name is medium rare, Richard insisted. It expressed his stance tactfully, but still showed his resolution. Medium rare. A strange name. Rolf understood Richard's meaning, but he merely smiled in response. He just thought it was another eccentricity of the noble mage, ignoring it as he started to inspect the traces of the battle. The more he looked around, the graver his expression became. The bloody scene during the battle was reconstructed in his mind. For his part, Richard had been informed about the battle by Ola. A single sweeping glance allowed him to see every detail by heart. He didn't need to know how exactly it had happened, the killer's name was enough. Rolf checked the troll's injuries once more before commenting, "This looks like the work of Blackwing." Oh. This medium well could actually keep up with Blackwing's subordinates for so long. Blackwing? Richard focused on the name. He's the most fearful fellow in Red Cossack, even harder to deal with than their two saints. Although he's only level 15, even I would have to be extremely careful if he decided to target me. Blackwing is a fiend of the shadows, a cockroach who can survive in the filthiest of places. Besides, he isn't alone. He has nearly 20 assassins over level 10 under him to dispatch as he pleases. Those two over there are his subordinates. Richard nodded, repeating, "His name is medium rare." "All right then, medium rare," Rolf replied a little grudgingly. Already finished inspecting the battlefield, he was secretly astonished. This troll had actually stalled Blackwing and his subordinates for so long. His body had sustained more than 100 blows. It was completely unfathomable. Blackwing was infamous for his vicious dagger techniques. The wounds he left behind weren't only meant to disable. Every slash at muscle and bone brought along the most intensive suffering. If one continued fighting after receiving a wound from him, there was a high chance that they would rip the wound apart. Medium Rare's own left arm was mostly ripped apart during the intense battle. What sort of resilience did it take to endure such suffering? However, Rolf did not ponder about this any further. He just chalked it up to the troll's superhuman physique and vitality. "How do you want to handle his corpse?" Richard asked Tiramisu, who had been silent all this while. Only after Richard's question did Rare's brother speak in a low voice, "Hand it to me, we have an ancient tradition in our tribe." "All right," Richard nodded at once. Rolf turned around, casting a profound glance at Tiramisu, but the troll did not even notice the gaze. The entirety of his focus was on his brother. The troll suddenly reached out to Gangder, "Lend me your axe." Gangder silently handed his weapon over. Even as everyone thought Tiramisu wanted to hack the assassins' corpses apart to vent, the mage walked over to his own brother's corpse. He looked over his brother's tragic state, unperturbed as he raised his axe and cut the head off in a single forceful blow. Some of the human soldiers cried out in alarm. Many of Richard's followers also changed expressions, unable to understand what the troll was thinking. He raised his brother's head in his hand, speaking in a low voice, "As long as I eat brother's brain, his soul will settle down in my body. I will use his skull as a necklace, always carrying it with me. This way, whenever I behead our enemies, he will see it too." This was a strange tradition, one that made the atmosphere suffocating. Richard pointed to the headless corpse, asking, "What about the rest of him?" "He can be handled in any way. In our tribe, the dead would become a meal. Otherwise, they would be deserted in the wild to feed the wild beasts." It was a way of giving back to nature, the mage explained. Richard nodded, "Then we can send him off with magic fire." He stimulated his Archaran bloodline, extracting blazing energy and mixing it with his mana. A crimson wisp flew out with a wave of his hand, landing on the corpse with a dull boom before beginning to burn violently. This spell was a variant of Hand of Flames, not considered a proper form of magic at all. However, the addition of the power from the Archaron bloodline turned it into a blaze. He pointed to the two other corpses. Zendrol, I leave these to you. They shouldn't be liberated in death. No problem. If I use them carefully, I can keep them for a very long time. The necromancer's voice was low and hoarse, carrying a hint of the sinister and stifling feeling of a graveyard. Rolf's countenance changed slightly, his gaze at Richard growing somewhat different. The mage was just far too young and handsome, giving people the impression that he depended on his family background to achieve success. It caused one to overlook the feats he had achieved. Richard's military successes were all glorious and splendid. Even though he wasn't a veteran of many kinds of battles yet, most high-ranking generals could not beat him in a melee. That was all the more true for an individual powerhouse like himself. The Sword Saint hadn't paid much regard to this overly handsome noble in the past. Although Richard's mentor could provide items he was unable to reject, this did not improve his impression of Richard himself. He hadn't lived too long yet, but he had already seen many geniuses who rose like comets but fell in a short time. It was this cruelty that caused him to re-evaluate the youth. Still, he did not think the level 11 mage could pose any threat to himself. A few more years, perhaps. There was an ancient saying in Failure, level is very important, but it is not everything. When people drew from the wisdom of ancient times, they emphasized the parts that they related to and valued. Those at higher levels would focus on the first half of this saying, while those who were weaker would focus on the second. Soon after, the tavern was swallowed by the raging flames. The two assassins' corpses were carried towards Richard's camp, with Rolf and Richard moving together on horseback. The Sword Saint was escorting him back to the inn, to prevent any further mishaps on the way. A huge part of the swordsman's profit was bound to the young great mage, and frail mages were always key targets for protection. Along the way, Richard described the general course of medium rare's battle to the death. The Sword Saint imagined the gruesome battle in his head, sighing involuntarily and speaking in a rueful tone. I truly did not expect a troll to sacrifice himself to protect his comrades. That is simply unlike his kind. He had wanted to describe the troll as brutal and foolish, but had thought better of it in the last minute and stiffly forced the words back down his throat. Richard seemed not to catch the implications in Rolf's words, replying calmly, every troll is different. It's just that most people never cared to understand them, thinking there was only one type of troll in the world. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. Please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 218. Brothers, 2. It was rather late into the night when they returned to the inn, but Richard wasn't feeling sleepy at all. He rearranged all the magic alarms and traps in their surroundings. Assassins were the nemesis of mages, but there were still a handful of ways to deal with them. High-level alarms and traps would render most of their kind helpless, and many spells could lock onto and track one's soul. Any assassin that was caught by a mage wouldn't have long to survive. This was all the more true in Failure, where the standard of magic was much weaker than in Norland. The abilities Richard had gained from the Deep Blue would ensure that even an ontomage would find it hard to break in, forget a regular assassin. Only a level 14 mage could remove Richard's alarms, but mages couldn't hide their aura like assassins. It would be near impossible for them to get past Waterflower's sensitive nose. Once he was finished with the defenses, Richard took out the rune that he had just crafted and walked towards the barracks. A bright bonfire was lit in the middle of the peaceful camp. Most of the tents rolled down without much movement outside of the nightly patrol. The only place that still had some semblance of activity was near the fire. Tiramisu and Gangder were sitting together, drowning out their sorrows in alcohol. Next to them was a pile of empty barrels, and two that were still unopened. It was obvious that it wasn't enough. An iron pot was perched over the bonfire, with the troll's signature soup boiling within. However, it seemed like Tiramisu was the only one interested in food as he had a plate before him. The only things in front of Gangder were jars of alcohol. Richard walked over and sat down, passing the box over to Tiramisu. This is a rune I made for medium rare, a standard elementary strength. None of us could have guessed that it would never be put to use. Tiramisu was stunned, unable to receive the case from Richard. Master, we are trolls. Can we even use runes? All living beings can use runes, Richard replied. Tiramisu still did not take the magically sealed box. Scratching his head out of habit as he asked, I never heard of a troll that could use runes. This is expensive stuff, you can get many barrels of wine with it. A standard elementary strength rune is worth about 100,000 gold in Norland, Richard answered indifferently. What he didn't mention was that his own runes were usually worth much more than market price. The one he had made for medium rare would go for at least 150,000 coins due to a greater boost. 100,000 gold. Even quality ale costs 10 gold a barrel. I can actually get 10,000 barrels with this. If I exchange half of it for cows, I can get 3,000. If I spend carefully, I'd be set for the rest of my life. Tiramisu quickly calculated the value of the runes in his own terms. Trolls were actually smart creatures, and their mages were used to numbers as well. Indeed. Richard pushed the case towards him. The troll shook his head profusely, eyeing the thing rather weirdly as if it was a bunch of delicious meat and wine instead of a box. Medium rare can't use it anymore. Give it to someone else, master, don't waste it. This belongs to your brother, no one else. Richard fixed his gaze upon the bonfire, sighing, the two of you have been by my side for a long time now, but I haven't been able to give you anything. Consider this a memento for Rare's sake. If you want you can bury it with your brother like humans do, as a companion. Brother doesn't need to be buried, he'll be together with me very soon. Tiramisu pointed to the pot of boiling soup. Only then did Richard notice something floating in the middle. Although it was only a third of its original size, this was undoubtedly medium rare's head. Indeed, then. With the body already burned to ashes by magical flames, there was nothing left to bury. Tiramisu took the pot down, ignoring the scalding heat as he held up the head and gnawed at it. Every movement was solemn and serious like in a devout ritual, the troll himself seeming rather divine. Richard and Gangder watched in silence. Moments later, the only thing left of medium rare was his skull. His brother had not let go of any flesh at all. It seemed like the soup was cooked using a secret method, because the skull both shrank down and gained a jade-like turquoise sheen that was completely different from a regular skull. Soon after, the troll emptied all the contents of the pot before sticking his tongue in and licking every nook and cranny clean. It was only then that he threw it aside, patting his belly loudly. Ah, I can feel brother settling down nicely. He then took out an iron chain that he had prepared earlier on, threading it through the skull and hanging it on his neck. Now he'll be able to watch me avenge him. Richard looked over the mage from head to toe. Well, use the rune for yourself then. It could be a companion that way too. Tiramisu didn't think much of that, merely laughing happily. In his heart, this rune truly was a fitting companion for his brother. The process of attaching the rune was quite simple. The troll had both the slot and the capacity, so within a few minutes Richard had fixed it onto his chest. This way, medium rare's skull could rest directly upon it. As for the extent of the strength boost, none present looked into it. Troll mages were different from the mages of other races. Their ability at magic was weaker in comparison, but they were extremely strong and had tough physiques. Even as the smartest of trolls, they did not forget about their primal battle instincts. As long as a hammer was brought into the picture, Tiramisu would become a dreadful killing machine. The three then sat around the bonfire, all drinking in silence. The 2 barrels of wine were emptied very quickly, but none of them were tipsy in the slightest. Their faces were all serious as they focused on the jumping sparks. No conversation was made, they all seemed to be thinking about something. The wine was soon gone. Gangder tipped the last barrel upside down, but only a pathetic few drops fell out and he tossed it aside begrudgingly. He thoughtlessly grabbed his huge axe, wiping it as he asked, "Master, don't you hate Red Cossack?" Richard flashed a smile typical of nobility, shaking his head as he replied gently, "Hate? No, I don't. There's no need to hate the dead. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 3, Chapter 1. Once lazy and luxurious. The sky in Norland was just as dark as in Failure, especially over Flow Bay. The thick clouds were so low the top of the deep blue almost pierced through them, and even though it was morning the sea was dark as dusk. All the ships were anchored into the harbor, even the open sea ships that moved with magic not daring to set off. In the high seas, the weather was the true master. No matter how grand and large a ship was, one wouldn't dare go through a storm with it. All the grand mages of the deep blue were gathered at the conference room. It was time for their monthly meeting, and the figure of the legendary mage was missing as usual. Sharon had recently been coming and going in a hurry, showing her face for no more than half an hour each time. She would just open another portal, traveling to another plane. The atmosphere in the hall was just as stressful as the weather outside. All of the mages looked glum, with no sooniness in sight. Black Gold had a thick stack of papers in hand, and was reading out from it with a hoarse voice that made it sound like his mouth was filled with wood shavings. This was the report for the income and expenditure of the Deep Blue in the past month. The numbers indicated that the finances were improving rapidly. No, they were going straight up. The most significant part, the categories of income and profit, had doubled from the last month. If not for their consumption increasing greatly as well, the profits would have grown much more than twofold. This was a number that could stir anyone up, but none of the grand mages could bring themselves to be happy. Even the dwarf himself was listless. Looking closely, one would realize that this increase in income had come solely from Sharon obtaining ample harvests during her journeys through the myriad plains. Every time she returned, she normally left some of her profits in the Deep Blue.